Our story begins with a man at the hospital to have his testicles removed, only to discover that the cancer cells had already spread throughout his entire body. But upon hearing this, instead of becoming angry, he simply clutched the protective amulet his wife had left him and burst into a fit of loud laughter. Deep down, he believed that only a fate ending his lineage could somehow appease the soul of his late wife. However, when he opened his eyes once again, we see the dusty, old wedding paper still stuck to the window of his childhood home. In a panic, he searched the house inside and out until he found Sarah, completely bare, curled up on the mud bed. In that moment, her wide eyes reflected a sense of absolute desolation. Her body, once flawless, was now covered in bruises that crossed in every direction. Seeing her again, the woman his soul had yearned for throughout his life, he was instantly overcome with emotion and rushed forward to hold her tightly. He had so much guilt and longing to express, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat, and so he simply broke down and began to weep bitterly. In his previous life, he had schemed for Sarah to fall into the reservoir, ensuring the whole village saw her in a disheveled state after he rescued her. To save her reputation, she was forced to marry him, but from the day she entered his home, she never knew a single day of peace. Driven by his endless domestic violence, she eventually jumped into the reservoir with their daughter in her arms, taking both their lives. It wasn't until his brother-in-law pulled their bodies from the river that the weight of it all finally hit him. After that, he left home and rode the wave of the era's economic boom to amass a fortune. He had all the money he could ever spend, but the woman who taught him how to grow through her own sacrifice was gone. Just as he was immersing himself in the joy of being reborn, a sudden, piercing scream shattered the silence. Outside the room, a voice cried out for him not to touch her. In that moment, we see Sarah trembling uncontrollably. He suddenly remembered that this was the time Sarah had borrowed money from her family to buy porridge for the baby. But he had cruelly snatched it away just to buy alcohol. To be honest, his past self was a truly wretched man. Worse still, he had come home drunk and brutally tortured her right there in their own home. As these memories flooded back, he raised his hand and began to strike himself across the face with a dozen hard slaps. Blood soon began to trickle from the corner of his lips, a physical manifestation of his self-loathing. Sarah watched his actions in silence, her lips curling into a faint, sarcastic smile. She had seen this performance before. She had lost count of how many times this had happened. Every time he woke up from a drunken stupor, the routine was the same. He would kneel and beg for her forgiveness, but within 2 days, his fists and feet would fall upon her body once again. She could endure the humiliation of his abuse, but she could not bear to see her daughter starving with nothing to eat. The baby's weak crying brought a flicker of life back into Sarah's beautiful, weary eyes. She hurriedly pulled on her clothes and took the child into her arms, trying to offer what comfort she could. But because Sarah was suffering from chronic malnutrition herself, she was unable to produce any milk for the infant. The little girl broke into a loud, hungry wail. Her cries seemed to finally snap him out of his trance. He immediately scrambled out of bed and began gathering his clothes from the floor. He told her to wait, promising that he was going to find something for their daughter to eat. Sarah didn't say a word. She simply watched him with a cold, hollow gaze that spoke of a heart already broken. And so, he rushed out into the world, desperate to prove that this time, things would be different. With those words, he set off on his long legs toward the small village shop. The shopkeeper, old John, showed his yellowed teeth the moment he saw him and asked what kind of alcohol he wanted this time, and if he intended to buy the porridge on credit again. He promised to pay the money back tomorrow, but old John, hearing the request for credit, simply stared at the red, swollen marks from the slaps on his face and said nothing. He took a bag of porridge from the shelf, and after a quick thanks, he rushed back home. When he stepped back inside and saw his wife exactly where he had left her, he felt another sharp pang of guilt in his heart as he told her he had the porridge. She immediately warned him not to even think about selling their daughter. Otherwise, she cursed that this family would end with them and leave no legacy behind. We see him freeze in place, completely paralyzed by the weight of her words. He vaguely remembered that something like this had happened before. He had planned to sell the child. He was going to give her to a couple in the village just to get more money for alcohol. To be honest, it is no wonder he died of liver cancer in his previous life. He truly deserved it, but for now, he simply placed the porridge on the old, dilapidated bed. He swore he would never sell their girl and promised to go into town the very next day. He intended to find real work, and with that, he turned around and walked back out. Once outside, he struck himself across the face several more times with all his might. If his memory served him, Sarah would jump into the reservoir with their daughter this very month. Just the thought of that tragedy made his entire body tremble with fear. As we see the sun begin to set, he realized there was still absolutely no food left in the house. 20 minutes later, he arrived at the foot of the mountain behind the village. It was then that he did something rather unexpected, pulling the elastic band from his own underwear. He fashioned a makeshift slingshot and, with a sharp crack, fired a stone into the brush. A turtle dove took flight, its wings beating frantically against the evening air. Now, you might wonder why he was so skilled. In his previous life, he had developed a passion for sport shooting. He had also spent quite a bit of time practicing with a slingshot back then. After crouching in the tall grass for nearly half the day, he finally managed to trap a pheasant with a net. He also managed to bring down several more turtle doves using his improvised weapon. The doves were quite small. 4 of them together didn't even weigh a single pound. The pheasant, on the other hand, was impressively plump, weighing in at over 5 pounds. He tied his catch together with sturdy vines and hung the bundle from a nearby branch. As he prepared to shoulder his haul and head home, he suddenly felt a strange void on his back. A cold sweat of pure terror broke out. He wondered if he had actually encountered a ghost. Suddenly, he noticed a faint glimmer of light coming from the protection amulet hanging at his chest. This was a trinket that Sarah, his wife, had worn every single day in his previous life. It wasn't made of jade or plastic, and she had kept it until the day she jumped into the river. She had taken it off and left it behind on the bank of the reservoir. When he looked closer, the mysterious light from the amulet vanished as quickly as it had appeared. And so, he couldn't help but reach out his hand to touch it, wondering what it all meant. In the very next second, we see him suddenly transported into a strange, hidden space. Judging by the size, it was no larger than his old hospital room, a modest sanctuary, indeed. After testing it several times, he finally began to understand the rules of this place. By holding the amulet, he could enter, and with a simple thought of leaving, he was back. With this special ability, he realized he could truly rise from the ashes of his former life. On his way home, he noticed that many houses in the village already had electricity. His own home, however, was still relying on the dim glow of oil lamps. The hardest years had passed, but he was still living meal to meal, day by day. Not knowing if there would be food tomorrow, he went to the kitchen to organize his haul. When darkness finally fell, he brought a large bowl of turtle dove soup into the dining room. He called out to Sarah, telling her the soup would help her strength while nursing the baby. He had to call 3 times before Sarah slowly emerged from the inner room. Seeing the steaming bowl of soup on the table, she didn't rush toward it as one might expect. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her eyes filled with a lingering sense of resentment. In that moment, seeing his wife dressed in clothes covered in patches, he felt another sharp pang of bitterness. In this era of such material scarcity, Sarah's natural beauty seemed to stand out even more, which only added to his guilt. He had been a scoundrel who won her heart but never truly knew how to value it. Now, seeing her so full of distrust, he desperately wanted to sit and eat with her. But he knew that as long as he stayed, she would never even touch her chopsticks. He told her he would eat in the kitchen, turning away immediately to give her space. Meanwhile, Sarah stood frozen in place, staring at the large bowl filled with turtle dove soup and tender meat. To be honest, the whole situation felt completely surreal to her. She wondered if this was a dream, or perhaps some kind of final, cruel meal. In the past, whenever there was even a scrap of food in the house, he would make sure he was well fed, leaving her with nothing but the dishwater. So, even though she was currently feeling a desperate, gnawing hunger, Sarah didn't dare take a single bite, at least not yet. It wasn't until she looked outside and saw him crouching under the window, sipping his soup, and noticed a large wild pheasant hanging by the kitchen, likely from the mountains, that she understood. Only then did Sarah finally return to the dining room to eat. She took the bowl and began to eat, and later, under her cautious gaze, he took it upon himself to wash all the dishes and bowls. Considering he used to be such a lazy scoundrel, this was likely the first time he had ever taken housework seriously. After that, reflecting on his past mistakes, he went to heat a pot of water and carried it into the bedroom. He told Sarah to use the warm water to wash up and rest her tired body. After setting down the basin, he quickly left the room to avoid making her uncomfortable. He sat by the door, and after a long silence, the soft sound of splashing water finally drifted from inside. As for him, he simply looked up at the starry sky, lost in his own thoughts. He began planning to find a legitimate job the very next day, hoping to improve their situation at home quickly. Autumn had already arrived, and we know that in winter, with temperatures dropping to 20 degrees below zero, water freezes instantly. His wife and daughter desperately needed winter clothes, otherwise, they wouldn't survive. The thought of losing them was unbearable. That was something he simply could not allow to happen. When the sound of splashing water finally ceased, he stood up and quietly entered the room. Seeing him appear so suddenly, Sarah was startled and instinctively scrambled backward in fear. She begged him not to come closer. Seeing this, he cursed himself for having been such a beast in the past. He understood then that her trauma wouldn't be resolved overnight. It would take time to heal. So, he spoke to her in a gentle tone, explaining that he was only there to take the water out. With that, he picked up the basin and the cloth from the floor and stepped back outside. Sarah didn't say a word, but the moment he cleared the doorway, she dressed herself as quickly as possible. Out in the yard, he used the remaining warm water she had finished with to give himself a simple wash. After all, to catch those turtle doves, he had been crouching in the damp undergrowth for a very long time. Once he was clean, he sat down on the threshold to think. To be honest, he had much to consider. He recalled his past life, remembering a time when outsiders wanted to enter the mountains to gather wild goods. Fearing they would get lost, they had sought him out, since he had nothing better to do, to act as their guide. Back then, he assumed those city folk were just bored and looking for a way to pass the time. But after watching them so many times, he had actually learned the proper way to harvest those wild products. Now, he could go dig them up and sell them himself. At that thought, his spirits rose instantly. He tied together a torch, gathered some rather unprofessional tools, and called out toward the house. He called out to Lily, telling her to lock the door tightly, because he was heading out for a moment. He was gone the entire night, and we see that he didn't return until 4 in the morning. To be perfectly honest, he was incredibly lucky. While coming down the mountain, he found a civet den. He managed to pull out several young civets that hadn't even opened their eyes yet. Upon returning home, he processed them immediately, leaving one portion in the kitchen for his family. Then, with 2 baskets balanced on his shoulders, he set off toward the nearby town. It was a market day, and after arriving, he searched for the perfect spot to set up. In the middle of the crowd, he began pulling the civet meat and pelts out of his baskets. He offered them as fine mountain goods, though he initially thought that if they didn't sell, he would simply cook them all in a pot and share them with his older brothers and sister. But he had barely finished laying out his wares when something unexpected happened. A passerby stopped and immediately asked for the price of the civet meat. An elderly couple approached, and seeing how young and tanned he was, they could tell he was a true woodsman. Finding the price reasonable, they asked for 2 at once. In those days, buying meat required ration coupons, so people often turned to these types of wild products instead. They wanted it so their young grandson could have a treat. As they were leaving, the old woman tugged on her husband's sleeve, signaling for him to stay. She decided to take all the civet pelts as well, claiming she would make gloves for her grandson. And so, in less than 2 hours, every single civet had been sold. Quite a success, really. After that, he brought out the wild rhubarb he had gathered the day before. He made his way to the town's traditional pharmacy. When he showed them his harvest, the old pharmacist, peering through thick glasses, was left completely speechless. He handled the rhubarb with care, examining it closely before holding up his hand to suggest a price. Our friend, however, felt his brow furrow slightly when he saw the low offer being made. Deep down, he felt the man was treating him like a country fool, so he reached out to pack his things. Seeing this, the old man quickly grabbed his hand to stop him from leaving. Stroking his goatee, he tried to calm him down, suggesting that if the price wasn't right, they could certainly negotiate a better deal, which, naturally, was what he wanted to hear. 6 large bills was the final offer. The old man claimed he couldn't possibly give more. Even though he had harvested the large root by accident, its true value far exceeded that price. But what choice did he really have when he needed money so urgently? He knew his wife and children were back home, struggling with hunger. After a moment's thought, he decided to sell it, immediately heading out to buy meat and flour. He visited 2 supply cooperatives until he finally found some rare powdered milk that he liked. As he prepared to head back, we see him pause as he remembered his wife's dress from yesterday. That old dress was covered in patches, so he stepped into the town's only small state-run shop. On his way home, he took a detour to find an old hunter who was over 70 years old. He traded a large portion of food, and in exchange, he managed to get the man's prized hunting shotgun. In those days, as we know, one needed ration coupons just to put meat on the table. If he wanted the freedom to eat well, he realized he would have to provide it himself. As he drew near his home, we see that Sarah, with their young child strapped to her back, was still out working in the fields. His older brother, Jack, was also there, and upon seeing him, he flew into a rage, demanding to know where on earth he had disappeared to this time. He scolded him for leaving his wife to toil alone in the fields while he was away. Seeing his brother standing there, he felt a sharp sting of guilt and emotion prick at his nose. He explained that he'd gone to town for work and picked up some meat and flour along the way. He then invited Jack to bring his wife and the children over that very evening. They should all have dinner at his house. Hearing this, Jack looked at him with deep suspicion. He examined him from head to toe, noting the mud on his trousers and the heavy, full basket. Jack mentioned that his own wife had just steamed a pot of cornbread for lunch. He told him to make sure Sarah took a few pieces home with her later. They wouldn't be coming for dinner, but he warned him to start treating his wife better from now on. Realizing there was nothing more to say, he simply nodded, shouldered his things, and headed inside. He knew that to win back his wife's heart, he first had to win over her stomach. And so, he set to work in the kitchen. By the time dusk began to fall, Sarah finally returned home, carrying the pieces of cornbread his brother had promised. But the moment she stepped into the courtyard, the rich aroma of cooking meat caught her by surprise. She hurried to the kitchen door and found him busy at work over the hot stove. Poor Sarah was absolutely starving after working in the sun all day long. She stood there for a moment, quietly setting down the cornbread she had brought. She entered the bedroom and gently placed the sleeping child into the crib. But as she turned her head, she spotted a tin of powdered milk sitting on the table. The blood rushed to her face in a fit of rage. She ran to the kitchen and raised her hand. She slapped him hard, demanding to know if he had gone to harass her mother for money again. She called him a shameless scoundrel. Being suddenly confronted by Sarah with such an accusation, he began to slowly remember that the man he used to be was, quite frankly, a terrible person. He had once even threatened his mother-in-law with a knife for cash, so he quickly denied it now. He told her he had earned all the money himself today while reaching into his waistband. Seeing this gesture, Sarah only became more infuriated by what she assumed were his intentions. She stepped forward and slapped him again, disgusted that he could think of such things at a time like this. After receiving 2 slaps in a row, he truly didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the misunderstanding. Seeing that Sarah had no intention of stopping her assault, he quickly pulled out the 5 $10 bills he had hidden in his clothes to show her. He tried to explain as he forced the bills into her hand, but she was frozen in shock. Sarah felt as though the entire world was spinning beneath her feet. Seeing that his wife was about to faint, he reached out to support her, but she violently pushed him away. She couldn't believe a lazy man like him could earn so much. At least not honestly. She wondered what sort of trouble he had gotten into out there. She told herself this couldn't be real and that things simply couldn't continue this way. Realizing that Sarah didn't believe a single word, he felt so desperate he nearly fell to his knees. He explained that he had climbed the mountain the previous night to gather wild dendrobium, and while he was up there, he happened to stumble upon a loris burrow. He traded those finds for cash, and after spending one $10 bill on food, he had this left. At the mention of the medicinal herbs, Sarah's eyes flickered with a hint of curiosity. It was hard to believe, after all, since dendrobium is rare and highly valuable. It can be sold for a high price, but it grows deep in the mountains and is notoriously difficult to find. Finding it at night seemed impossible, yet she remembered the blood she saw by the well this morning. And, of course, there was the pot of stewed loris meat sitting right there in the kitchen. She began to wonder if she had truly misunderstood his actions this time. Still, a question remained. How did a man like him even know how to recognize such a rare herb? Under Sarah's watchful gaze, he raised his right hand and swore he hadn't done anything wrong. He even staked his family's future on the oath, and finally, he saw her expression begin to soften. He let out a long sigh of relief and told Sarah to keep the money safe for them. He then mentioned he was going to take some of the meat over to his older brother's house. He wanted them to have a taste as well, and though he could have hidden the money himself, letting his wife manage the finances was his way of handing over the authority of the household. He left the freshly cooked tofu and carp soup on the table for her to enjoy. Returning to the kitchen, he filled a bowl with meat and set off toward his brother's place. Along the way, he planned to repay the money he owed for little Johnny's rice porridge and his old debts. Meanwhile, we see Sarah standing alone, staring down at the bills in her hand in total silence. She hurried back to her room, reflecting on the fact that in the 2 years since they married, it had always been him taking money from her, rather than the other way around. This was the very first time he had ever handed over money voluntarily. Cautious as ever, she divided the bills into 5 parts and hid them in separate places. After finishing, she stayed inside for a moment until she heard firm footsteps outside. She stepped out and saw a plate of vegetables and a steaming bowl of soup waiting on the table. For a moment, Sarah felt a bit dazed. Then she went into the kitchen to take a look around. She found the rice pot was nearly half full, which was a rare sight indeed. The oil jar was full too, and a large slab of bacon hung from the ceiling. Had he really changed? Sarah couldn't be entirely sure just yet, because as we know, it is often said that an old dog rarely learns new tricks. Seeing that she remained silent, he placed a tender piece of meat into her bowl. He told her he would head back up the mountain at dawn, before the winter chill truly set in, planning to search every spot where those valuable herbs might be hidden. It was, after all, the fastest way for them to make a living for the time being. He spoke of a future where they could invest that money once the economy opened up. Hearing his ambitious words, Sarah froze for a second before giving a small nod. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew he had been incredibly lucky to find that herb last night. One cannot count on such luck lasting forever, and deep down, she wanted to remind him that if he truly wanted to earn a living, he should probably look for a steady job. Even if it was only a few cents a day, she felt that was better than having no income at all. But considering his character, as long as he wasn't out gambling or drinking, she decided to let it slide. He picked up his chopsticks and tried to put the choice piece of meat back into her bowl. Seeing this, Sarah immediately used the baby as an excuse to stop him, but he insisted, telling her she was far too thin and needed to eat more, or the baby wouldn't have enough milk. Formula, no matter how good it might be, simply couldn't compare to a mother's milk. Not to mention it was expensive and hard to find. He had even prepared some carp soup. It was made with tofu, a dish specifically meant to help her health and the baby's needs. These words caused Sarah to look at him with a sudden, sharp intensity. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped her chopsticks, but in the end, she didn't refuse him again. By now, he had been awake for a full day and night without a single moment of rest. He was exhausted. Fortunately, the family's immediate survival was finally secured. Once he had finished his meal, he spoke to her quite directly. He told his wife he was going to sleep first, and with that, he stood up from the table. He stepped into the inner room, lay down, and fell into a deep sleep almost instantly. When Sarah finished washing the dishes and returned to the bedroom a little later, she noticed the clothes he had discarded lying there on the floor. She picked them up and discovered a set of new women's clothes and 3 small outfits. For the baby, she stood there, simply watching him sleep for a long, quiet moment. She realized she no longer understood this man at all, while he remained completely dead to the world. During the night, the baby woke up twice, but even that wasn't enough to wake him from his exhaustion. It wasn't until dawn that he finally opened his eyes, feeling dazed as he rolled over in bed. He saw Sarah curled up with her back to him, wearing nothing but an old, tattered vest. Seeing her like that, he remembered how, after her death in his previous life, he had never been with another woman. And so, he reached out his arm to pull her close, needing to feel that she was truly there. It all felt as fragile as a dream, and just as he leaned in to give her a kiss, Sarah's body suddenly tensed in his arms, clearly resisting his touch with a cold, silent fear. He immediately suppressed his desires, realizing he had pushed too far, and quietly got out of bed. For now, he would simply have to be patient. He grabbed his shirt from the drying rack. Even though it was still slightly damp, he pulled it on quickly and moved stealthily through the room. He took the items out of his bamboo basket and arranged them carefully on the table. At that moment, Sarah sat up in bed and spoke to him, her expression remaining cold and distant. She told him that if he truly wanted to change, he should find a real job and put in the effort. With a steady wage, they could earn $10 a month and finally give their family a future. Hearing his wife take the initiative to speak to him like this was a small victory. Deep down, he felt a surge of joy, knowing that Sarah was actually thinking about his well-being. But fate had given him a second chance at life, and he had much larger plans in mind. He needed to gather his starting capital quickly before the markets fully opened up to the world. We must remember that in his previous life, after he lost both his wife and daughter, he had wandered the streets like a stray dog for a long time, until he met someone very important. In his previous life, he had the opportunity to work as a waiter in a state-owned shop. Because he was a smooth talker, he was eventually promoted to manager. And that was how he began to rub shoulders with powerful people from all walks of life. In this life, however, he needed to earn his starting capital with his own hands as quickly as possible. That's why hunting at the Stone Lake was the fastest way to make money at that moment. And most importantly, he now possessed the memories of his past life and knew exactly where those Stone Lakes were located. It was an opportunity far too good to miss. How could he possibly let it pass? The only problem was explaining to his wife why he insisted on going to the mountains to find that lake. Sarah, seeing his silence, knew he had made up his mind. So, she simply pulled up the blanket and went back to sleep. In the kitchen pot, there were still some cornmeal buns she had left out for him. Hearing her words, he said nothing, but his face showed a joy he couldn't quite hide. Then he leaned over the bed and gave Sarah a gentle kiss on the cheek. He told her that he had spoken with her older brother the day before. She didn't need to help them today. Instead, once she finished with the pork in the kitchen, she should take half of it to her mother's house. Sarah, seeing him approach, feared for a moment that he was angry and might strike her again. But she never expected that he was actually trying to win her over. She hadn't heard him clearly, nor did she see his intentions, but the change was undeniable. And before heading out, he stopped to give his daughter a kiss as well. By the time she finally reacted, he had already vanished without a trace. In the dark room, only she and her daughter remained, sleeping soundly in the crib. Even though it was still early, she tossed and turned, unable to find sleep again. She stayed in bed until the sun began to warm the house, when a sudden knock came. She wondered why her sister-in-law was visiting so early and if something was wrong. We see Linda glancing sideways, her eyes searching the interior of the kitchen. She smiled brightly, mentioning she'd heard from the eldest sister-in-law about their luck. She asked if they'd eaten meat last night, wondering if Sarah's husband had won big gambling. As she spoke, without waiting for an answer, her feet moved instinctively toward the kitchen. She gasped, wondering aloud if the family had resorted to stealing or looting. She couldn't help but calculate how much such a large piece of meat must have cost. To be honest, they hadn't seen a single scrap of fat in nearly half a year. The children had cried for days, yet they hadn't dared to buy any for themselves. When she finally looked away, her eyes caught something on the dark wall. Half a pheasant was hanging there, causing her to lose her composure instantly. She warned Sarah to watch her husband, claiming gambling could land him in prison. Hearing this, Sarah's expression turned serious as she questioned what her sister-in-law meant. She told her that if anything was illegal, the police would surely handle it. She made it clear there was no need for such concern. Meanwhile, Mark wanted to add something, but his eyes darted around as if a new thought had occurred. She quickly swallowed the words that were already on her lips, pleading with Sarah not to be angry with her. She claimed she was simply worried about her brother-in-law, Mark, who was her own husband's brother. Her little son, Billy, had been crying for days because he was desperate to eat some meat. And so, she finally got to the point, asking if Sarah could spare 5 pounds of meat. She promised to tell her husband to bring the money over later, though we can guess how likely that was. After living together for nearly 2 years, Sarah knew all too well that her own pockets were empty. She was already intimately familiar with the kind of person her sister-in-law really was. She knew that once something entered that woman's house, it was gone forever, like giving a bone to a stray dog. Asking for 5 pounds of meat all at once was a bold move, and Sarah didn't dare make that decision alone. Even if she had the authority to manage the household, lending it out would have been completely out of the question. She told her sister-in-law that such an important matter wasn't hers to decide. She suggested waiting for Mark to return to ask him directly, before turning away and abruptly shutting the kitchen door. Linda felt a surge of annoyance at this cold reception, but she tried to keep her composure. She told Sarah to remind Mark to bring the meat over to her house as soon as he got back. The moment Linda turned her back to leave, that forced, bright smile of hers vanished instantly. By then, it was already nearing midday, and the sun was high in the sky. Meanwhile, relying on the memories of his past life, Mark had finally located a wild ginseng root after a grueling search. Using the experience he gained working in the dark the day before, he carefully uncovered the majority of the roots. This specimen was much larger than yesterday's find, and it wasn't until the sky began to darken that he finished. With extreme caution, he finally managed to extract the entire massive plant from the earth. Just as Mark was preparing to head down the mountain, he turned around and came face to face with a cicada. It seemed the creature was looking for a taste of the ginseng, so he quickly pulled out the rifle he had acquired. In an instant, a single shot echoed through the silent forest, sending the local birds fleeing in every direction in a panicked flurry. Meanwhile, back at the house, Sarah had already prepared dinner and warmed the milk for their daughter. But as the minutes passed and Mark still hadn't returned, she couldn't help but frown with worry. She told herself that finding wild ginseng wasn't easy and that he really ought to learn a proper trade. While Sarah was momentarily distracted, Mark managed to slip quietly back into the house. After stashing the ginseng, he went out to the yard to unpack his basket, and that was when Sarah finally heard him. She stepped outside, carrying their little girl in her arms to see what the commotion was about. She simply told him to wash his hands and come eat, before heading back inside with the child. He noticed, however, that his wife stole a quick, curious glance at his basket before she left. She didn't say a word, but when he walked in, a steaming hot dinner was already waiting on the small table. His eyes grew misty, and deep down, he wished he could travel back to his past life just to give his old self a piece of his mind. He wondered how he could have failed to cherish such a beautiful and virtuous wife before finally sitting down at the table. He mentioned that he needed to visit the village head's house later that evening. Upon hearing this, Sarah, who had been gently patting the baby to sleep, suddenly froze. She couldn't help but point out that if they got electricity, they would have to pay a bill every single month. She finished speaking and watched him out of the corner of her eye, her heart racing. She was terrified that her words might spark his temper and cause him to flip the table in a rage. Mark subtly caught the look of fear on Sarah's face and realized she was waiting for a blow that wasn't coming. He quietly set down his chopsticks, walked to the door, and brought the basket inside to show his wife. He explained that this was what he had dug up today, and he planned to sell it at the city pharmacy for a good price. Sarah was left completely speechless, staring in stunned silence at the bundle of roots he had placed before her. She finally looked up at him, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and disbelief as she asked him a question. She wondered if he had truly dug it up himself, and seeing her doubt, he began to explain the day's events. He swore to her that he hadn't stolen it or taken it by force, which, given his history, was a fair concern. He reassured her that this was truly the fruit of a long, hard day of labor up on the mountain. Sarah studied his calm expression, and only then did she nod, caught between lingering doubt and a growing sense of relief. She then mentioned that his older sister-in-law had stopped by during the day, asking to borrow 5 pounds of pork. Seeing Mark frown with clear displeasure, she realized that the woman had likely given her a hard time while he was away. The sister-in-law hadn't really come to borrow anything. She had simply come to make life difficult for Sarah once again. With a serious expression, Mark told her that from now on, she was the one in charge of their home. He insisted that all the money and their belongings were now under her absolute control. He told her that if she didn't want to lend anything, they wouldn't, which left Sarah feeling quite hesitant. After reflecting for a long moment, she admitted timidly that she really didn't want to lend the meat. She knew the sister-in-law claimed it was only a loan, but they both knew the truth of the matter. The woman would never return it, as it certainly wasn't the first time she had taken things from their house and forgotten to pay them back. Hearing Sarah finally stand up for herself brought a genuine, satisfied smile to Mark's face. He affectionately nudged her nose and told her that if she didn't want to lend it, then that was the end of the matter. They weren't going to tolerate her bad temper anymore, and seeing Mark's genuine smile, Sarah found herself completely stunned. A moment later, he gently picked up his daughter and carried her into the inner room to rest. After finishing his meal, Mark took it upon himself to wash the dishes and the chopsticks. He then cut a small portion of meat and stepped out into the darkness of the night. When the village head, Mr. Miller, saw him approaching, his weathered face twisted into an expression of pure shock. However, as soon as he felt the weight of the meat in his hands, his wrinkles softened into a wide, welcoming smile. He asked Mark what business could possibly bring him by so late in the evening. While the old man accepted the gift, Mark explained that he wanted to finally install electric lights in his home. He asked if the village head could find the time to help him get everything set up properly. The old man agreed immediately, promising to take care of the matter first thing the next morning. Hearing this, Mark didn't linger. He stood up, offered his thanks, and turned to head back home. But as he passed by his own kitchen, we see him spot Sarah standing alone in the shadows. She was quietly gnawing on the leftover meat bones he had discarded earlier that evening. The sight was a physical blow to him, making his very blood run cold with a sudden, sharp guilt. With a voice turned hoarse by emotion, he asked her what on earth she was doing. Startled by his voice, Sarah jumped, and the bone she was holding slipped from her hand and fell. She looked at him with terror in her eyes and pleaded with him not to hit her. She explained through her fear that she only thought it was a waste to throw away the bones he had chewed. In that moment, Mark felt as if he had been struck by lightning, overwhelmed by a crushing sense of defeat. And then, without a word, he suddenly dropped to his knees before her with a heavy thud. Terrified, Sarah let out a sharp cry, asking him what on earth he was trying to do. She lowered her gaze, looking down at the man kneeling before her in the dim light, until she felt a dampness against her skin and realized that Mark was actually crying. Her heart, which had been locked away for so long, seemed to soften just a little. Seeing his wife so frightened while eating his scraps felt like a jagged knife, one that drove itself deep into the very center of his soul. And so, he stood up and gently took his wife's pale face between his hands. He leaned down and softly kissed away the tears at the corners of her eyes. He told her to go to the inner room and wait for him there. Once the food was ready, he promised he would bring it to her himself. He called her his great benefactor, though Sarah didn't quite understand those words. She blushed as if she had seen a ghost and quickly hurried out of the kitchen. Working quickly in the kitchen, he soon had a plate of fragrant stir-fried meat ready. He remembered how the coarse bread felt stuck in his throat, yet his wife treasured it, hardly daring to take a single bite. Just as he entered the inner room, the sight of her snow-white back was suddenly reflected in his eyes. In an instant, he felt a rush of heat and emotion surge through him. He stepped closer and, from behind, he pulled her into a warm embrace. He whispered for her never to leave him again, and Sarah felt a sudden, rare sense of peace. It was the first time since their honeymoon that they had truly shared a bed together. They had never been so intimate. Recalling the events of the previous night, Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm. But as she turned her head toward the cradle, she suddenly went pale with a flash of fear. It seemed she hadn't heard her daughter cry once all night, which was strange given how much Mark had changed. With her eyes fixed on her daughter, she scrambled out of bed and, in just a few quick steps, she reached the baby's side. There she saw the little girl was already awake, watching her with wide, smiling eyes. In that moment, looking down at the child, Mark felt his own heart soften completely. He carefully took his daughter into his arms and carried her back toward the bed. Seeing that the baby was safe and happy, the heavy weight in Sarah's heart finally lifted, and her frayed nerves began to relax. Then, her eyes reddened and she nearly burst into tears, guilt-stricken that she could have slept so deeply throughout the entire night. With a child so small, she told herself that if anything had happened, she wouldn't be able to go on. Mark gently told his wife to stay there and rest a while longer with little Lily. He went to prepare breakfast, while Sarah took a moment to check the diaper beneath the baby. To her surprise, although it wasn't tucked in very neatly, it was perfectly functional. The diaper was clean and had been changed. No wonder she hadn't heard her daughter cry last night. It was because this man, whom she had resented for so long, had actually gotten up to care for her. It was the very first time since the baby was born that he had taken an active role in parenting. She wondered if he had truly changed, and if she could dare to trust him just one more time. Meanwhile, we see Mark busy in the kitchen, waiting for his wife to emerge with the baby in her arms. The meal was ready: tofu, fresh greens, corn porridge, and warm rolls made of cornmeal. There was a variety of cereals. With his chest bare, Mark gently took the little girl from Sarah's arms. He told his wife to go wash her hands first, but Sarah felt a flicker of worry. Seeing him look so clumsy as he held the little one, she couldn't help but let out a small giggle. He reminded her that this was his own daughter, not a tiger, and certainly not about to bite. During their meal, Mayor Miller and the local electrician arrived at the house. As they entered the courtyard, they saw Sarah eating at the table while Mark, still shirtless, paced back and forth with the baby in his arms. The mayor noticed a very distinct bite mark on Mark's inner arm, and he gave a knowing smile. He remarked that Mark hadn't even finished his own breakfast yet. To be honest, Mark hadn't expected the mayor to bring help over quite so early in the morning. He led the mayor and the electrician to the edge of the courtyard to inspect the power lines. Just as Sarah finished her meal and headed back inside the house, he handed the baby over to his wife, then pulled a pack of premium cigarettes from his loose pocket. The mayor, seeing the expensive brand in Mark's hand, flashed his yellow teeth and grinned. He chuckled, noting that the young man had clearly moved up in the world to afford such things. The electrician, a simpler and more cheerful man, tucked his cigarette behind his ear, shouldered his ladder, and headed around the house. This job was already turning out to be quite profitable. Even the electrician rarely treated himself to such a luxury. It was a rare indulgence, really. He decided this family was exceptionally generous. Once the electricity was finally connected, Mark went back inside. As he walked in, a piece of clothing came flying toward him. Before he could react, he heard Sarah's voice. She told him to put his clothes on quickly, as it was shameful to walk around half-naked like that. At that moment, we see several distinct scratches across Mark's back. They were marks from the previous night, left there by Sarah herself. The mayor and the electrician had certainly noticed them, but they wisely said nothing. Mark, however, remained blissfully unaware as he wandered around shirtless, which was precisely why Sarah was feeling so incredibly embarrassed. She wished she could simply disappear into a hole. With strangers present, she didn't dare mention it. It wasn't until Mark finally went to the bedroom that Sarah, covering her burning cheeks, took a long moment to calm down. Afterward, she began stripping the mattress to wash the linens. She carried the baby's crib out to the courtyard and gently placed the little girl inside. After filling a basin with water, she prepared herself to scrub the heavy mattress. Just then, Sarah's mother arrived at the house carrying a small basket. Inside were a few eggs and a piece of meat. When Sarah saw her mother, she hurriedly dried her hands and stood up to greet her. She asked her mother what had brought her by so suddenly. The mother carried the basket into the kitchen, looking her daughter up and down with a critical eye. Seeing Sarah's old, ill-fitting clothes, the older woman's eyes began to well with tears. She quickly looked away, picking up her granddaughter from the crib and explaining she had just finished her chores. She said she had simply come for a visit, though her eyes kept wandering over the old, three-room adobe house. Deep down, her heart was filled with a growing sense of distress for her daughter. She told herself she should never have agreed to this marriage in the first place. She felt she had ruined her daughter's life. "Sarah," she said softly, calling her by name. "I've been thinking that if you truly can't go on with him, it might be better to get a divorce. You're still young, and you have so much of your life ahead of you." She insisted that Sarah shouldn't let herself be destroyed by such a miserable man. Upon hearing her mother's words, Sarah was momentarily stunned into silence. She sat down on a small stool and remained quiet for a long while, lost in thought. She remembered that day when Mark took the money he had borrowed from his family. He had spent the baby's formula money on alcohol, leaving Sarah feeling utterly hopeless. Back then, being with him felt like a dead end. She had even considered ending it all. In her darkest moment, she had actually thought about jumping into the water with her daughter. But when Mark finally sobered up, he seemed truly repentant and slapped himself repeatedly in regret. After that, he had rushed out immediately to buy food for the little girl. Over the last few days, we see that she has noticed a complete change in him. He no longer wanders aimlessly, he doesn't drink, and he has stopped gambling entirely. Seeing her daughter sitting there in silence, the mother assumed she was worried about the baby. She told Sarah that if she wanted to take the child, she would help her raise her. However, she hesitated. The problem was that if Sarah remarried while having a child, finding a new husband would be difficult. In this era, after all, divorce was incredibly rare. No matter how hard life became, it was expected that a woman should simply endure and move on. Sarah realized her mother had already spent a great deal of time worrying about her future after a divorce. Sarah gently took the little girl from her mother's arms, holding her close. She told her mother that she wasn't thinking about divorce anymore, as Mark seemed to be improving. As she spoke, we see her softly tugging at the new clothes the child was wearing. She explained that these were the clothes he had bought with the money he earned for the girl. He had even bought an outfit for Sarah herself, though she hadn't put it on yet. Her mother looked at her and noticed her delicate face was flushed with a healthy color. It was a glow she hadn't seen in a long time, and her eyes had regained their sparkle. The older woman was stunned, remembering how she had overheard a neighbor just the day before. The neighbor had mentioned that Mark owed $50 to someone in town. With such a massive debt, she hadn't dared to confirm it, wondering how he could ever pay it back. That was exactly why she had been so uneasy and brought supplies to visit her daughter so early. But looking at her daughter's expression now, it was clear she wasn't pretending to be happy. She decided not to mention the debt, fearing it might make Sarah angry or stubborn again. Regaining her composure, she nodded with relief, her eyes still slightly red from the emotion. She told her that if he truly could change, she would finally be at peace. She said this while quietly wiping the tears from the corners of her eyes with her hand. Meanwhile, we find Mark climbing the mountain, chewing on a bit of wild herb as he worked. He was busy calculating the cost of building a two-story house based on the current market prices. He figured that after selling the medicinal plants he found, he could build the house and have savings left. In this era, that amount of money would be considered quite a fortune. Not bad at all. After all, in this day and age, a household with $10,000 was a rare sight indeed. He figured he would likely have to stay in the village for at least another couple of years. His first priority, naturally, was to improve their living conditions. The 3 adobe houses they called home were so cramped that, at his height, he felt he couldn't even stand up straight. Inside, the dust was unbearable, clinging to every corner and hanging from the ceiling. It really wasn't a fit place to live. At that moment, our protagonist had no idea that his mother-in-law was still debating with his wife whether a divorce was the best path forward. If he had known, he probably wouldn't have had the heart to spend the next few days digging for valuable herbs on the mountain. After all, having been given a second chance at life, he knew that while money mattered, nothing was more important than his wife and child. He still carried all the secrets of making a fortune from his previous life, which was quite an advantage. So, he felt no need to rush. As noon approached, we see that Sarah's mother hadn't even stopped to eat. She was in a hurry to get back home. Fearing that every bite she took was a bite she was stealing from her daughter's mouth, Sarah couldn't manage to stop her, so she quickly ducked into the kitchen instead. She grabbed the hanging meat and sliced off more than half of it with one swift stroke. Holding it high, she ran out the door to catch up with her mother. She insisted her mother take it home so her brother and sister-in-law could have a proper meal. Seeing such a large piece of meat, the older woman waved her hands in a firm refusal. Fearing that if Mark found out she was helping her own family so much, things would turn sour. She was terrified that Mark might hit her daughter again, or worse, that Sarah would go hungry. Sarah insisted that her family take it, telling her mother they had plenty of food at home. She told her mother not to worry, but the older woman just looked at her daughter's thin frame. She worried that if Sarah didn't eat well, she wouldn't be able to nurse the baby properly. In the end, Sarah's mother firmly refused to take the meat with her. She picked up her basket and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone at the door. We see Sarah watching her mother's figure grow smaller and smaller until she finally vanished from sight. Only then did she pick up the meat and head back into the quiet kitchen. Their neighbor, Jane, was roughly the same age as Sarah, though she seemed much older. She had been married for 2 years already and had skin darkened by long days in the sun. While slicing raw radishes, she peered over the wall to catch Sarah's attention. She mentioned that while Sarah stayed inside, the rest of the village was buzzing with gossip. Apparently, the night before, Sarah's second brother had given his wife a terrible beating. Several families nearby had heard the screams and the crying echoing through the night. Sarah stepped out of the kitchen and sat on a small stool in the courtyard. She offered a few brief responses, though, to be honest, her heart wasn't in the conversation. Seeing that Sarah was quiet, Jane moved her stool closer to her washbasin to continue. Lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, she shared what everyone was saying behind closed doors. The rumor was that her brother's eldest son didn't actually belong to her brother at all. Upon hearing this, Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, her hands freezing mid-task. Jane looked up at Sarah and whispered that the child actually belonged to her eldest brother. We see Jane watching the confusion and shock wash over Sarah's face. She popped the rest of the radish she'd been munching into her mouth, wearing the face of a seasoned gossip, and leaned in to whisper more secrets. Sarah, hearing this, was left utterly stunned. She truly couldn't believe that such a thing was even possible in their family. She had always respected her eldest brother, believing him to be an honest and loyal man. He had always been fair in his actions, carrying himself with the dignity of a true older brother. But hearing this news cast a long, dark shadow over her heart. How could something like this happen? Jane, for her part, seemed very satisfied with Sarah's reaction. She gave the young wife who had recently arrived from the village a friendly pat on the shoulder. She announced that she had to head home to start cooking dinner for her husband. She couldn't stay to chat any longer. Later that night, Mark returned home very late. As he approached from a distance, we see him notice the warm light glowing inside the house. He couldn't help but sigh quietly to himself as he walked. This electric light was certainly much brighter than the old tallow lamps they used to use. Upon seeing him arrive, Sarah quickly took the warm dishes and white flour buns out of the pot. She asked him in passing why he had returned so late today. She noticed a bit of dirt clinging to his clothes, and, quite naturally, she reached out to brush the mud off his jacket for him. He quickly moved to hide it, turning away and closing the door to the main room behind him. Then, from a pile of grass inside a wicker basket, he carefully pulled something out and placed it on the table. He had been out digging for orchids, but on his way home, he stumbled upon an unexpected find. He decided not to tell his wife that it only happened because he had slipped. He had taken a bit of a tumble, and that was exactly when he spotted this treasure. It took him quite a while to climb back up, which, naturally, was why he had arrived so late. The price for this was currently no lower than the rare orchids. It was sold by the gram. It could be considered a small, unexpected windfall for the couple. He planned to spend a quiet, intimate night with his wife before heading back to the mountain the next day. But first, he needed to sell the valuable merchandise he now held in his hands. Sarah looked at the dark brown object he had placed on the table, noting it looked a bit like ginger. She felt as though she had seen it in a book once and asked, with some uncertainty, if it was FOTI root. Her tone was full of disbelief, and to be honest, he hadn't expected his wife to be so knowledgeable. Most people in the village still had no idea just how valuable a find like this actually was. If they did, all the treasures on that mountain would have been picked clean long ago. In truth, wild FOTI root would remain a highly valuable commodity for at least another dozen years. Later on, as cultivation technology advanced, these plants would be grown artificially in great numbers. They would eventually become common everywhere, losing their status as a rare and precious find. But even then, the price for wild medicinal herbs would remain exorbitantly high. The reason was simple. The wild versions were becoming nearly impossible to find. Flashing a wide, bright smile, Mark pulled his delicate wife close to his chest in a warm embrace. Inclinas la cabeza y presionas con fuerza, su rostro blanco y suave. Mirando fijamente sus brillantes ojos. De gist, sí, en esigu. Mañana te llevaré a ti y la nina a dar una vuelta por la ciudad. Al or que llevarían a la nina fuera de casa. El cuerpo de zo yao ese tenso de repente. Recordando lo que él había dicho antes. Que había vender a su hija a esa familia de la ciudad que no podía tener hijos. Todavía sentía un nudo en el estómago al pensarlo. Quien sabe si de verdad no podían tener hijos. O si la compraban para criarla como esposa infantil. Se soltó de su abrazo, y con precaución y desconfianza, ese nego. La nina es un pequeña. Nosotros dos no iremos. Anda, levate las manos y com. Viste al instante que tu esposa estaba rara. Originalmente querías lavarla a puer, de paso, comprar ropa de invierno. Pero al verla ponerse otra vez en guardia, claramente temía que volvieras a tener malas intenciones. Con la nina, esas caneladas que hiciste. No era tan fácil que ella superara ese renser. Hacia tiempo que habías agotado su confianza. Solo podía ir paso a paso. Te quites la camisa manchada de barro, abriste la puerta, saliste. Te lavaste la cara rapidamente y volviste a la habitación para sentarte. Solo entonces viste la comida en la mesa. Un plato de huevos revueltos dorados y otro pequeño platito con la carne salteada que había sobrado de la mañana. He wondered if she had eaten anything at all for lunch. If she continued being this frugal, how could he ever help her gain some weight? He realized he needed to earn more money quickly. He asked where the eggs came from. Sarah lowered her head and served him a bowl of thick flour soup, explaining they arrived shortly after he had left. She mentioned her mother had visited and brought them, without even bringing up the divorce. Hearing they were from his mother-in-law, he remembered the times he'd begged her for drinking money. He felt a wave of shame, barely able to face the thought of her. He didn't even dare ask why his mother-in-law had come by in the first place. Internally, he began making calculations. Tomorrow, once he sold his goods, the first thing he would do is pay back the money he had taken from her. He reached out, gently took his wife's hand, and had her sit down with him. He told her to eat quickly while handing her a whole grain bun. His wife still hadn't brought herself to bake buns using only white flour. Instead, she had made these using a mix of whole grain and white flour. He took a simple cornmeal bun for himself and began eating in large, hungry bites. Sarah took a small bite of her bun and stole a glance at the man sitting across from her. She thought to herself how wonderful it would be if he could stay this way forever. However, she had no idea how long this sudden change in him would actually last. As the two of them ate, a voice suddenly called out from the door, calling for Sarah. It was a local named Ben, shouting for her to come out because they were one person short. The man shouted that the boys were all waiting for her husband to come drink and play cards. Upon hearing that voice, Sarah's face turned pale as she sat beside him. She stared at him without blinking, terrified he would go back to his old ways of gambling and drinking. He was stunned for a moment by the voice, until he finally remembered who it was. He set down his chopsticks and looked up, only to see the sudden paleness of his wife's face. He stood up quickly and pulled her into a protective embrace. He asked her what was wrong and where she was hurting, his voice thick with genuine worry. Sarah remained wrapped in his arms, her thin, pale fingers trembling. She gripped the fabric of his shirt tightly against his chest, as if holding on for dear life. Her lips quivered as she asked if he was really going to go out gambling with them again. Hearing those words, he finally understood exactly why his wife was reacting this way. To be honest, she had every reason to fear he would fall back into his old, destructive habits. He rested his chin on her soft hair and, without thinking, tightened his hold on her. He pulled her even closer, noticing once again just how terribly thin she had become. Since the day she married him, she hadn't known a single day of true peace or comfort. Even a simple, hearty meal had become a rare luxury in their household. And yet, despite everything, she still harbored a flicker of hope for him. All she wanted was a stable life by his side. He took a deep, shaky breath. Forcing back the stinging tears in his eyes, he began to soothe her with a low, raspy voice. He told her not to worry because he wasn't going anywhere, promising to send them away immediately. He promised her that from now on, he wouldn't be getting into any more trouble with those men. Sarah, who was still leaning into his embrace, felt a flicker of uncertainty. Upon hearing those words, she lifted her face and stared at him with damp, questioning eyes. She asked if he was truly staying, and he looked down into his wife's restless, tearful gaze. He felt a desperate urge to prove himself, to show her that he had truly changed his ways. He couldn't help but gently kiss the tip of her slightly upturned nose once again. With a warm, steady breath, he promised her once more that he really wasn't going anywhere. He told her to be at peace, as he was going to send them away immediately. Then, with great care, he helped his wife sit back down on her stool. He told her to keep eating and promised he would be back in just a moment. As he straightened up, he realized her hand was still gripping his shirt tightly against his chest. If he didn't know those three men outside were trouble, he might have taken her with him. To ensure she saw him reject them and finally find some peace, he lowered his head. He gave her another comforting kiss on the top of her head as a final reassurance. His large, rough hand gave her thin back a gentle, soothing pat. Only then did she slowly let go of his shirt, her fingers finally relaxing. He stood tall and began to walk toward the door with long, purposeful strides. He reached the courtyard entrance and pulled open the weathered wooden door. We see the men waiting at the entrance as they watched him step outside. A man named Earl gave a vulgar smile and began to joke with crude insinuations. Earl sneered, mocking him for being unable to leave the house the moment his wife stepped into the yard. He complained that several days had passed without him joining the group for a drink. Our protagonist's expression darkened with a threatening energy as he growled for the man to get lost. He warned him to speak with respect from now on, or simply keep his mouth shut. The other two men, who had been laughing along at first, suddenly went quiet. Seeing his twisted, angry expression, they immediately stopped laughing and tried to play the role of mediators. They told him not to mind Earl, claiming the man just had a foul mouth and meant nothing by it. They insisted they all go for a drink, and one of them reached out to place a hand on his shoulder. He quickly raised his hand to brush the man's arm away, showing he wanted no part of their camaraderie. He glanced coldly at the other two, telling them that if it was about drinking or gambling, they should never come looking for him again. The three of them stared at him as if they had seen a ghost, completely baffled by his serious tone. They exchanged looks of utter confusion, unable to recognize the man standing before them. Earl, however, still wore that same vulgar, greasy smile. With a reckless lack of self-preservation, he continued to joke, asking if his little wife had him locked up. He suggested that since she was recovered, he should come out for a drink, but he never finished the sentence. Before the words could leave his mouth, a heavy kick landed squarely in the middle of his chest. The force sent him flying through the air until he crashed onto his back on the hard ground. As Earl lay there groaning, our protagonist stepped forward and placed a heavy boot between the man's legs. He leaned down, his dark eyes flashing with a terrifying ferocity as he stared the wretch down. He warned the man that the next time he let such filth spill from his mouth, he would sew both his mouths shut and break that third leg of his for good. As he spoke, he pressed his boot down harder, giving it a slow, agonizing twist. Earl, sprawled on the ground and ignoring the sharp pain in his chest, desperately grabbed the heavy boot that was crushing his crotch with both hands. He wailed like a lost soul, begging for mercy and admitting he was wrong. He swore never to speak such nonsense again, while the other two stood by in stunned silence. Our protagonist radiated a murderous aura that, in the dead of night, was truly terrifying. No one dared to intervene, as they had all feared him since they were children. He had always been a ruthless fighter, but they had never seen him this enraged, looking for all the world like a furious tiger ready to tear someone apart. It was enough to give anyone goosebumps. However, he worried the commotion might alert his wife. He didn't want her to witness his violent side, especially over something so trivial, fearing she might grow afraid of him all over again, which would be a true disaster. He straightened his posture and looked down at the pathetic man on the ground. He finally withdrew his foot and told them to get out, a command they treated like a royal pardon. They quickly hauled Earl to his feet and offered a hurried, respectful gesture. They bid him a shaky farewell, and, as soon as the three of them had vanished, he let that violent energy fade away, stepped back into the yard, and bolted the gate. Inside the house, we find that Sarah had been restless and uneasy ever since he left. She felt as though she were sitting on pins and needles, every passing second feeling like an eternity. Our protagonist had been gone for quite some time, and Sarah was beginning to fear the worst. Her heart was heavy with worry, and though her stomach was growling with hunger, she couldn't bring herself to take a single bite of the steaming food on the table. In just a few short days, as she watched him slowly improve, she had, without even realizing it, begun to place her hope in him once again. She didn't expect him to become rich or powerful, nothing so grand as that. She only wished for him to lead a quiet, stable life by her side. But if he had returned to his old ways of drinking and gambling, what would she do? Their child was still so small, she couldn't possibly take him to work with her. Would she really have to face a divorce? While lost in these dark thoughts, she heard firm footsteps, and she couldn't help but turn her gaze toward the sound of his approach. She saw his tall silhouette stepping inside, framed by the pale glow of the moonlight. In that moment, Sarah's dull and weary eyes suddenly lit up with relief. He hadn't gone off to lose himself with those scoundrels after all. She was still dazed when he reached her, wrapping his broad arms around her in a warm embrace. He leaned down and gently kissed her soft, pale cheek. Then, he picked up a cornmeal pancake and began to eat with a hearty appetite. Sarah was still processing the moment when she instinctively asked if he was truly done with those men. He playfully reported to his lady wife that he had broken with them completely and would gamble no more. Sarah nodded then, finally finding her own appetite as she began to eat slowly. As she ate, she couldn't help but steal a few glances at her husband. She watched him eat quickly yet with surprisingly good manners, noting his sharp, handsome features. He was actually quite pleasant to look at, which was part of why she had married him, besides him saving her life. Back then, she had been a bit swayed by his fair complexion and good looks. She had let her heart lead the way. Perhaps she felt she deserved her current lot, but she wondered what he was thinking now. He placed a golden fried egg onto her pancake and teased her with a playful smile. He told his wife to eat up, joking that she could stare at him all she wanted once they were in bed. His shameless nonsense was enough to make Sarah snap out of her daze and stop staring. Seeing his bold attitude, she shot him a mock glare, her face flushing a deep red. She lowered her head and continued eating, while he showed no signs of being in a hurry to leave. He sat on a corner stool, his eyes fixed intently on her every move. The more he looked at his wife, the more he realized just how much he truly cared for her. Even in an era where resources were scarce and the food was often poor, and despite the total lack of cosmetics, her skin remained remarkably soft and smooth. However, he noticed the red, worn marks on the knuckles of the hand holding her chopsticks. Gently, he took her slender wrist and brought it closer to his eyes to inspect the damage. Thinking of the heavy sheets hanging outside, he decided that tomorrow he would sell what he had. His goal was to secure a voucher for a black market washing machine to ease her burden. In this day and age, most people didn't even know what a washing machine was, let alone own one. And even fewer people would be willing to spend their hard-earned money to buy one. With a washing machine, however, his wife would never have to scrub clothes by hand again. Sarah gently pulled her hand away. Feeling embarrassed by his intense gaze, she told him that if he was finished, he should go heat some water to wash up, as he was still covered in mud. He stood up, gave his wife a quick kiss on the cheek, and headed to the kitchen to heat the water. Once he was gone, Sarah set down her chopsticks and touched her burning cheeks. Since yesterday, this man hadn't stopped hugging and kissing her every chance he got. Every time he drew near, she could sense his presence so strongly that her heart began to race. It felt like a trapped rabbit, leaping out of control, and she simply couldn't understand what was happening to her. After dinner, he took her hand and suggested they go for a walk to help their digestion. On the way back, instead of heading straight home, he guided her in a different direction. Near the old cow shed, they came across a set of ruins. Outside stood a makeshift mud stove. A woman inside the house was clutching her chest, coughing incessantly. As she took a handful of cornmeal and began mixing it with water, she placed the mixture into a ceramic pot that was chipped and broken around the edges. Even those few simple steps caused large beads of sweat to form and roll down her face. Just then, we see a man with salt and pepper hair approaching with long strides from a distance. She frowned as she took a bowl of water, telling him to go to bed and rest while she finished the cooking. The woman looked at him, her exhaustion evident in the dim light. He handed her some food and insisted he wouldn't go to bed while she moved back toward the stove, repeating her plea. The woman looks at him with a mixture of stubbornness and worry. She tells him quite clearly that she isn't going to bed yet. Once again, she insists that she has no intention of resting just yet. She looks him in the eye and tells him that if he doesn't stop to eat, he won't survive this illness. To be honest, her fear for him is written all over her face. The man finally gives in, answering her in a low, tired voice. His eyes feel irritated and heavy as he claims he already ate well today. But deep down, he wonders what they will eat tomorrow, knowing he hasn't cared for himself. That small handful of rice was only gathered by begging from several families in the village. She suffers for him, knowing he has been busy all day without a single bite to eat. And he suffers for her, watching her endure the hardships of the fields by his side. He gently squeezes her hand, telling her not to overthink things right now. He urges her to rest so she can heal, promising to find her medicine tomorrow. He assures her she will get better, while Jake watches the scene with a heavy heart. On the way back home, Sarah asks him about the situation that couple is facing. He remains silent for a moment. How could he explain? He didn't know the man well. But in his previous life, he had seen that very face on the television. That old man, after years of massive business success, donated his entire fortune when he died, all in the name of his beloved wife, establishing a charity for medical care. His greatest regret in life had been failing to protect the woman he loved back then, watching her suffer through that illness and eventually die based on his memories. Jake assumes that this was the very cause of his wife's tragic passing. It was the same sickness, but he calculates that her condition was worsened primarily by malnutrition, living in a drafty shed with only watery meals to sustain her each day. In such conditions, even a mild illness can quickly become fatal. He plans for Sarah to deliver the medicine along with enough money to invest in that future tycoon. At the very least, he might secure a tutor before the college entrance exams. The next morning, long before the sun had even thought of rising, Jake was already wide awake. He quietly slipped out of bed and walked over to the crib. Carefully, he took his daughter in his arms and gently placed her beside his sleeping wife. After tucking the small blanket around her, he prepared breakfast for Sarah and, after quietly closing the door from the outside, he set off on his journey. It is a very windy morning, despite the early hour. To be honest, it's quite biting. We see many travelers already on the road. In this era, out here in the countryside, anyone owning a sturdy two-wheeled bicycle was considered to be in quite a good financial position. Because of that, most people still have to rely on their own 2 feet to get around. Guided by the memories of his previous life, Jake finds his destination without any trouble at all. In the heart of the city, there is a large traditional pharmacy where a square-faced, middle-aged man greets him. The man examines him from head to toe before taking the damp package to inspect it closely. He realizes the package contains wild ginseng, with every single root complete and in perfect condition. The man can't help but be surprised. Carefully, he places the damp package onto the counter. He asks tentatively, wanting to know exactly what price Jake is looking for. Upon hearing this, Jake simply asks the man to make him a fair offer first. He didn't beat around the bush, however, and eventually named a direct number. Jake knew exactly how the negotiation would go. Sure enough, the pharmacy manager, hearing that price, realized immediately that Jake was not a man easily fooled. He took a long look at the basket and invited Jake into the back courtyard. They spent nearly an hour back there, locked in a quiet, intense discussion. Finally, he sold the 2 rare plants, the medicinal root and the deer antler. He was quite satisfied with the day's earnings as he tucked away 50 $10 bills. And so, he left the pharmacy. With cash in hand, he headed straight for the state-run store. He wanted to buy a washing machine, but the clerk's response left him utterly speechless. He slapped his forehead in realization. Although washing machines did exist in this era, they were only for hotels and commercial laundries, not for private homes. Not yet. The first domestic models hadn't even been produced. To be honest, he was a bit ahead of his time. However, by a stroke of luck, he managed to secure a voucher for a 9-inch black and white TV. He didn't hesitate to buy it, along with vouchers for oil, meat, and flour. The local traders quickly realized they had a very important customer on their hands. They became exceptionally friendly, and learning he was taking the TV home that very day, they found an acquaintance with a tractor. For $2, they would haul everything to the village. Jake accepted the offer without a second thought. Then, at the state store, he bought his wife a fashionable red sweater, along with some trousers and a pair of leather shoes. He also picked up several sets of new clothes for the children and a few fresh quilts. He bought everything he could think of, filling half the tractor trailer, much to the driver's shock. Looking at the sacks and bags, the man couldn't believe this young fellow in old clothes had such wealth. By the time he finished this massive shopping spree, the day was already growing late. We return to Sarah, who woke up that morning to find her son sleeping soundly by her side. Having no idea when Jake had slipped away, she stood up, her body feeling heavy and sore. She noticed that before leaving, he had prepared a meal and left everything perfectly organized. On the table sat golden eggs and pieces of meat that were still practically sizzling. Deep down, Sarah couldn't deny that she felt a flicker of genuine emotion. But her heart was still guarded. Just then, the village chief arrived with a bright-eyed young woman. He introduced her as Lily, an educated girl from the city who had been sent down to the village. From now on, she would be living in their house, and he told Sarah to prepare a room for her. Sarah was utterly stunned. The idea of suddenly having a stranger in her home was overwhelming. In those 3 small mud brick rooms, she wondered how they were all supposed to fit. There was one bedroom for the couple, the dining area, and the other room was filled with junk. Where was she supposed to put her? She told the chief that Jake wasn't home yet. She insisted she couldn't decide this alone, but the chief just smiled, his face wrinkling up, and waved his hand dismissively at Sarah, not listening to a single word she said. The old man gave the young city girl a few final instructions and simply walked away. To be honest, if it hadn't been for the meat Jake had gifted him earlier, he likely wouldn't have sent such a pretty young woman to their home. This group of educated youths from the city totaled more than 20 people. Most of them were strong young men, ready for the hard labor of the fields. Only this one delicate girl remained, and the chief had personally assigned her here. We see the irony, a young couple living there, and the newcomer is more beautiful than the rest. Regardless, the chief felt there was nothing to fear under that roof at night. He wasn't worried about a young, handsome wife being coveted by a stranger. At that moment, Lily, clutching her canvas bag, stood and stared. She observed the 3 crumbling mud brick houses with a sinking feeling. Deep down, she sensed the days ahead would be far more difficult than she imagined. Compared to the others, her friend Emily had been assigned to a family that seemed well off. Emily's hosts were a middle-aged couple with 3 well-dressed children. On the way, people had warned Lily that the man of this house was not a good person. They said he drank, gambled, and frequently raised his hand against his wife. The family was supposedly so poor they could barely keep a pot on the stove. Before arriving, she told herself they were exaggerating. They weren't. Now she saw they hadn't lied at all. The woman of the house, in her worn-out clothes, still possessed soft skin and delicate features that hinted at a hidden beauty. Like something out of a classical painting, she didn't look like a typical farm woman at all. Sarah felt that sharp gaze scanning her, so she looked down at her own old, patched clothes. She then glanced at the newcomer, who wore a modern chiffon dress, white stockings, and leather shoes. The girl was radiant, though Sarah pretended not to notice the scrutiny and simply told her to sit. He looked down at himself, noting his own worn-out and heavily mended clothing. Then he looked at the woman before him, who was dressed in a fashionable chiffon skirt. With her white stockings and high heels, she looked both radiant and remarkably elegant. He pretended not to notice her searching gaze and quietly suggested that she take a seat first. We see the room is quite a mess, cluttered with all sorts of old junk and household items. Sarah explained she had to wait for her husband to return before she could clear space for her. With that, she turned to fetch a thermos and poured some hot water for her guest. Sarah nodded, feeling a bit awkward as she sat on the courtyard bench, lost in her own thoughts. She was determined to find a way to get that notice to return to the city, to leave this place. She didn't want to stay a single day longer, especially not in the home of a known thug. From now on, she realized she would have to tread very carefully indeed. She couldn't allow the man of the house to take any advantage of her situation. Sarah had planned to start cooking at noon, but with the new city girl's arrival, things changed. She simply had to roll up her sleeves and begin preparing a meal for them both. Lily decided that since she was staying there, she couldn't just expect free room and board. And so, she washed her hands and headed into the kitchen to offer her help. "Sister-in-law, how about I light the fire?" Lily asked as she stepped into the kitchen, only to freeze in her tracks. The kitchen was surprisingly tidy, and a large, impressive slab of meat was hanging right there from the beam. She wondered who had started the rumor that this family was too poor to even feed themselves. If they were truly struggling, they certainly wouldn't be able to afford meat, especially not a piece that size. Sarah was busy kneading dough with her head down, but upon hearing Lily's offer, she looked up and simply said that she didn't need any help in the kitchen. She suggested that if Lily wanted to be useful, she could keep an eye on the children out in the courtyard. Lily nodded and headed back outside, where she leaned over the cradle to look at the baby lying there. The child was as fair as a porcelain doll, with a face that was, quite frankly, adorable. As she leaned down to play with him, she couldn't help but think that the woman of the house was roughly her own age. Sarah was so pretty and fair, it made Lily wonder why on earth she had married so young. How could such a woman settle for a man who was not only useless, but a known thug as well? She began to wonder if the poor woman had been forced into the marriage by that scoundrel. Just the thought of such a tragedy sent a visible shiver down Lily's spine. The more she thought about it, the more frightened she became, wondering if she should go to the village chief. She felt she had to ask for a different placement. Anywhere else would do, as long as the man of the house was decent. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, Sarah was busy cooking, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in her guest's mind. To be honest, she had no idea the city girl was imagining such a dark and elaborate backstory for her life. A little later, a bowl of steaming hot noodles was ready and lifted carefully from the pot. Sarah carried it out and called to her guest, inviting her to come and eat while the food was still hot. Lily finally snapped back to reality. She stared at the noodles floating in oil within the bowl on the table, and she was absolutely stunned. She quickly introduced herself, saying her name was Lily. She told her sister-in-law that from now on, she could simply call her Lily. Sarah nodded without saying another word. Around 4 in the afternoon, a tractor roared into the village and came to a halt right in front of the house, just as instructed. Sarah, who had been busy shucking corn out in the courtyard, suddenly heard the commotion outside. She dropped what she was doing and hurried to the gate. Just as she went to look, she saw Jack jump nimbly down from the tractor and paused, lost in thought. She wondered why on earth he had returned on such a noisy machine. Before she could ask, the driver shouted. He asked the young man if all these things would even fit inside his house. With that, the driver walked around to the back of the vehicle, gesturing toward the heavy load. Sarah stood there in complete disbelief, asking if he had really bought all of this himself. There were so many items, and even a television set among them. She couldn't help but wonder how much money and how many ration coupons this must have cost. Jack saw her face, turned pale as she stared. He stepped closer and gently stroked her cheek, knowing deep down that she was only worried about the money. But to him, that small amount didn't matter at all. He only wanted his wife to enjoy a good life with him and never have to suffer again. He leaned into Sarah's ear and whispered softly for her to stay calm. He promised to explain everything later, but first, he needed to unload the supplies. Upon hearing his reassuring words, Sarah moved aside and watched as the items were lowered from the vehicle. As the supplies piled up like a small mountain, Sarah felt a pang of regret for not going with him. She told herself that if she had known, she would have carried the baby to the city herself to help. She wondered how he could be so reckless with money and where on earth he got the coupons. In any normal family, a television was an impossible luxury, especially with the cost of electricity. Meanwhile, Lily stood in the corner with the baby in her arms, her eyes fixed on the young man. She had heard he was the village bully, a man with broad shoulders and a commanding presence. She expected someone coarse and vulgar, but his sharp, handsome features took her completely by surprise. To be honest, she had rarely seen a man so striking in her entire life. As she watched him, her heart began to race. Lily finally understood the truth of the matter. She saw why a woman as beautiful as Sarah had married so young. It all made sense now. This man was even more handsome than the actor she had seen in the movies. Once the unloading was finished, Jack pulled $2 from his pocket and paid the driver. The driver waved and rattled away on his tractor, leaving Jack to move the goods into the courtyard. When Sarah tried to help, he gently stopped her, insisting that she sit down and rest instead. He wouldn't hear another word about it, wanting only for her to be comfortable. The local elder, Mr. Miller, watched from a distance, wondering if Jack had sold something precious to afford this. He hurried over, but felt a wave of relief when he saw the baby was still safe in Lily's arms. Without saying a word, Mr. Miller began to silently help carry the heavy supplies into the yard. He stared at the heavy iron box of the television, imagining the magic of it once it was plugged in. He pictured the images and sounds that would soon fill the room, bringing the whole house to life. Mr. Miller circled the box as if he were watching a movie, curious, yet far too shy to actually reach out. He hesitated to touch it, knowing such things were incredibly valuable, costing hundreds of dollars. This was what the city folk called a television, a true marvel of the modern world. He never imagined his own brother would bring one home, making it the only one in the entire village. After settling the supplies, Mr. Miller led Jack to the courtyard entrance to ask the question on his mind. He wanted to know where all that money came from. Without a hint of worry, Jack patted his chest confidently. He explained that it all came from hunting, with the profits traded for goods on the black market. He decided not to tell his older brother about the rare herbs yet. It wasn't a matter of trust, really. The truth was that those herbs grew only on the most treacherous cliffs, far too dangerous for most. Even if he shared the secret, his brother couldn't help much, and if word leaked out, things would get complicated. He would effectively be cutting off his own source of income. Once spring arrived and the ice finally melted, he planned to take both his older brothers up into the mountains to show them the way. He would find the best spots and teach them the tricks of the trade, and from that point on, their success would be in their own hands. Mr. Miller wanted to advise him to stick to farming the land. But as he looked at his brother, he saw a certain spark in his eyes that gave him pause. There was a sharpness and depth there he had never seen before, as if he were looking at a complete stranger. Even as the eldest, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he no longer truly recognized him. Jack realized that since his brother was already here, it was the perfect time to speak. He took the opportunity to share his plan for building a new house and asked for his brother's help. He offered a wage of $1 a day. Mr. Miller took a long drag of his cigarette, wondering if Jack had gone mad. He insisted he would even work for free. After all, why would he ever charge his own brother a daily wage? But building a house is no small feat. It requires a significant amount of money and careful planning. Jack reassured him that he had the funds and insisted on paying the wage regardless of their bond. He believed that even between brothers, accounts should be clear, and then he asked for a specific favor. He needed his brother to find a truly skilled master mason. The request, naturally, caught Mr. Miller off guard. He also wanted the highest quality materials, aiming to move into the new house before the winter chill arrived. Mr. Miller nodded, initially assuming Jack only wanted to repair the 3 old, thatched huts they already had. Who could have imagined he had the courage or the ambition to build a full 2-story home? The reason he was entrusting all these heavy responsibilities to his older brother was quite simple, really. Jack was simply so busy that he couldn't possibly manage every detail of the construction on his own. His plan was to harvest all the valuable herbs from the mountains before the first snow began to fall. If he happened to stumble upon other wild medicinal plants like milkwort, he knew they could be sold for a profit. And if he were lucky enough to cross paths with a sicked deer, well, that would be a different story entirely. Securing deer antlers or other rare parts would be like finding a hidden treasure chest in the middle of the forest. Seeing that it was still early in the day, the two brothers decided to pay a visit to the local official, Mr. Wong. In this era, building a house and purchasing bricks required a formal permit, a process that was rarely simple. As the village head, Mr. Wong held an immense amount of power over such matters in these changing times. After gifting him a pack of premium cigarettes and discreetly slipping him a $1 bill, they managed to secure the necessary permit to buy the bricks without any further complications or delays. With the permit finally in hand, they headed straight for the local commune's brick factory to begin their work. As they placed the order for the bricks, our friend Mr. Miller stood there, completely perplexed. He couldn't help but ask how many bricks were actually needed and how thick Jack intended the walls to be. The sheer volume of the order was baffling, until Jack calmly explained he was building 2 entire floors. Mr. Miller watched in silence as Jack pulled out 2 high-value $10 bills. Without so much as a blink, he handed them over to the factory owner as if it were nothing. Mr. Miller felt a physical pang in his chest, especially when he heard Jack promise to pay the rest. The moment the bricks arrived at the house, his eyes went wide with disbelief. To him, it felt surreal. After all, that was hard-earned currency, not mere scrap paper. On the way home, we see Jack keeping the receipt tucked safely in his pocket. He showed no fear of losing it, while Mr. Miller looked at his younger brother with new eyes. This man, once a ruined gambler, now stood before others with a confidence regarding money that made him look more like a high-ranking executive than the factory owner himself. Just by standing there, he commanded a certain respect without ever raising his voice. If he were wearing a clean, unpatched jacket, one might mistake him for the son of a powerful leader. And people would likely believe it, too, if it weren't for the dark mole on his neck and the scars from past brawls still visible on his hand. Mr. Miller might have suspected his brother had been secretly replaced by a stranger. They continued their walk back home. Mr. Miller felt as if he were floating, his head spinning from the day's revelations. His younger brother had changed, of course, that much was undeniable now. But he couldn't shake the feeling that everything about this transformation was incredibly strange. As they drew closer to home, Jack reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out 5 high-value bills. He handed them over to his older brother, Mr. Miller, along with the instructions for the wood. He then asked him to take full charge of sourcing the rest of the building materials. Mr. Miller reached out to take the money, but suddenly felt as though his hands were far too dirty. He quickly wiped them on the hem of his clothes before finally accepting the cash. With the utmost care, he tucked the money deep into his pocket for safekeeping. Terrified of losing it by accident, Mr. Miller spoke to Jack with absolute sincerity. With this much money on the line, he promised his brother the job would be done right. He vowed it would be impeccable, nodding firmly to emphasize his commitment. Deep down, they both knew that without Mr. Miller and his wife's help during the hard times, Jack's wife might not have even survived the birth of their young daughter. Everything could have been ruined by Jack's past mistakes. Meanwhile, back at the house, we see Sarah busy organizing all the new things Jack had brought home earlier. She took a clean towel from the cupboard and carefully draped it over the new television set. She was terrified the dust might ruin it. To be honest, she wondered why he bought it at all. In their village, the power went out constantly, and setting up an antenna was a nightmare. When there was no signal, the screen was just static, but seeing Jack so excited, she didn't have the heart to complain about him spending so much money. She soon discovered he had bought gifts for her and the girl, a sweater, pants, and new shoes. There were also several beautiful new outfits for their little daughter to wear. The jacket Jack had bought for their daughter the last time he went to town hadn't even been worn yet. Sarah hadn't dared to let her use it, and now, here, he was with even more new clothes. But seeing how much he truly cared for both mother and daughter, Sarah felt a wave of genuine happiness. She took the light, soft, and thick quilt he had brought and prepared to store it carefully in the wardrobe. She couldn't help but shed a few tears. It was even better than the new cotton quilt from her wedding day. As everything was being put in its place, Sarah realized that this man hadn't bought a single thing for himself. His own shirt was covered in patches, and his shoes were worn through with holes. Meanwhile, a neighbor named Lily stood nearby holding the little girl, staring longingly at the new clothes while scratching her head. Like a cat eyeing a fish, she noticed a crewneck sweater that was the most fashionable style in the city. She had desperately wanted to buy that very same piece herself at the shopping mall. However, her parents had refused to let her spend half a month's salary on a single sweater. Seeing the clothes she desired but couldn't afford appearing right there, and not just one piece, but many, Lily felt a sharp sting of envy. To be honest, Sarah's husband was quite handsome as well. He spent money on his wife without a second thought and took such wonderful care of her. While moving the heavy items, he hadn't wanted Sarah to lift a single finger. Terrified she might get tired, he watched over her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. The rumors that he was just a lazy bachelor were clearly nothing but nonsense. Just then, we see Jack stride back inside. Upon entering, he noticed the unfamiliar young woman, who was holding his child and smiling while watching his wife. He wondered if she was a friend. Sensing his gaze, Lily shyly lowered her eyes. She didn't even dare to look him in the eye. Although she considered herself a city girl and usually looked down on these country folk, things felt different today. Ever since Jack had returned home covered in dust on his tractor, Lily had been standing there to one side the entire time, watching him. However, his eyes and his heart were focused entirely on his wife. As for Lily, despite being right there, he hadn't glanced at her even once from start to finish. Sarah had been busy with her own tasks, and hearing Jack's question, she realized there was someone else in the house. The young woman had been so quiet that Sarah, absorbed in organizing the new purchases, had forgotten her entirely. Sarah hurried over, offering an apology as she reached out to take the little girl from Lily's arms before turning to explain the situation to Jack. She explained that the village chief had brought this young woman over, and she hoped to stay with them temporarily. She asked him what he thought, suggesting they could prepare the west room for her to stay in. Her tone was purely consultative. Although he had told her she was the one in charge of the house, she still didn't dare make such a big decision on her own, fearing she might make a mistake. Hearing that a stranger might be staying in their home, Jack couldn't help but frown slightly. To be honest, he didn't want anyone else disturbing the private life he shared with his wife. But seeing Sarah's expectant look, he couldn't bring himself to say no, fearing she might think he was slighting her. So, he said nothing for a moment. First, he led his wife further inside and took off his jacket. Then, he reached into a hidden pocket and pulled out the money left over from selling the mountain goods. He handed her every last cent of the remaining profit, proving once again where his priorities lay. After that, Jack took the little girl from Lily's arms and began to play with her. As they stood there, he shared his ambitious plan to build a brand new house. Sarah took the money from his hands, and seeing the crisp, high-value bills, she felt a wave of disbelief. He had bought so much, yet so much cash remained. Could those mountain herbs and deer antlers really be worth that much? It seemed impossible. And then, of course, there was his sudden idea about building a new home. Sarah quickly tucked the money away, hiding it carefully under Jack's watchful, eager gaze. She fell into a brief silence. If they didn't build, the money from these 2 trips would be enough for the 3 of them to live comfortably for several years. As for her younger brother, he had already helped their family quite a bit recently. Now that he had his own children to support, she couldn't possibly ask him for more. While Sarah was lost in these thoughts, Jack seemed to read her mind completely. He whispered to their daughter, loud enough for Sarah to hear, not to worry about money. He would handle everything. She just needed to rest and not overwork herself. The sudden, warm sensation of a kiss on her cheek made Sarah blush a deep crimson. She looked at him with eyes full of affection, whispering a soft, "What are you doing?" She reminded him they had a guest outside. Honestly, he had no sense of shame. But Jack, with a skin as thick as a fortress wall, simply looked at Sarah and smiled. In his past life, he had been a man of great status who had seen it all. With that in mind, he leaned in once more, lowering his head toward her. He leaned in and softly kissed Sarah's full, red lips, lingering for a moment. Looking at his wife's flushed, rosy cheeks, Jack felt his heart completely melt. He teased her gently, wondering how she could still be so shy after becoming a mother. He stopped teasing and returned to business, mentioning that his brother would order the materials tomorrow. He reminded her to give his brother the money without hesitation if he happened to run short. Sarah nodded in silence, though a strange, nagging feeling began to stir in her heart. She recalled the neighbor's gossip regarding Jack's older brother and his second sister-in-law. Just the thought of the older brother made her feel deeply uncomfortable for some reason. Jack noticed immediately that his wife's expression had suddenly clouded over. He leaned closer, pressing his cheek against hers, and softly asked what was bothering her. He told her that if something was on her mind, she shouldn't keep it bottled up. Sarah considered telling him for a moment, but in the end, she simply shook her head. Jack didn't push her. Meanwhile, Lily, who was still standing out in the main hall, vaguely overheard Sarah mentioning that there was a guest waiting outside. Her face instantly turned as red as a beet from the sheer awkwardness of the situation. She stepped quietly into the center of the courtyard to catch a breath of fresh air. She hesitated, wondering if she should find the village chief and request a different place to stay. The man of the house didn't seem nearly as bad as the local villagers had claimed. As the younger sister-in-law was tidying up, Lily stood there holding the child in her arms. She saw it clearly. In this place, most children were expected to work for the household. We see that there was also plenty of clothing prepared for the child and the younger sister-in-law. However, she noticed nothing belonging to the man himself. Meanwhile, the little girl in Lily's arms had already fallen into a sweet, deep sleep. Her face, as delicate as carved jade, was the very picture of tranquility. Lily turned around slowly and gently. She carefully placed the sleeping little princess onto the bed, tucking her in with a warm blanket. A moment later, Sarah stepped out of the room to speak with their guest. She told Lily that for tonight, she would simply have to make do with what was available. It seemed the things in the West Room had piled up quite a bit over time. She worried that her husband, Jack, might not be able to get everything organized immediately. Upon hearing Sarah's words, Lily turned her head to face her. Seeing Sarah's flushed cheeks, Lily couldn't help but recall the private conversation she had vaguely overheard from the other room. Her own face heated up, and she quickly looked away. She insisted it was no trouble at all and expressed her gratitude to both Sarah and Jack. Lily spoke with a hurried politeness, while Sarah simply smiled and shook her head. She remarked that as long as Lily didn't look down on their modest home, everything would be fine. When Sarah went to move her daughter's wooden cradle to the East Room, Lily rushed over to help. Sarah smiled and then turned toward the West Room, intending to help with the tidying there as well. As for Jack, who had been working bare-chested, he finally gave in to his wife's persistent requests. He pulled on a white t-shirt, though his muscular arms remained clearly visible. While the shirt showed his strength, it also hid the various scratches covering his broad back. Jack didn't quite understand why his wife insisted he wear a shirt, but he complied anyway. Gathering several bamboo rakes in his arms, he prepared to carry them out to the patio. He had just started working when he saw Sarah entering the room with her sleeves rolled up. He stopped her immediately, telling her there was no need for her to help him there. It was far too dusty, and he urged her to go back out and stay in the courtyard. When he saw that Sarah wasn't listening to him, he began to feel a bit anxious. He set down the plow and the harrow he was holding and gently ushered her toward the exit. Deep down, he felt such tenderness for her that he couldn't bear the thought of her working in the dust. If it weren't for the fact that they were building a house soon, with many men coming and going, he wouldn't have insisted on this educated young woman staying safely inside the house. Upon hearing his protective words, Sarah's face flushed a deep, warm red. She smiled shyly and said nothing, thinking to herself how much this man had truly changed. As long as she was home, he wouldn't let her lift a finger for any chore. He even boiled the water for her to wash with at night and carried it to her room. Lately, she truly felt as though she were being cared for with the utmost devotion. It was almost too good to be true, so perfect that it actually made her a little afraid. Sarah feared that this enthusiasm might fade and that he would return to his old ways. So she lived each day with a heavy heart, feeling a lingering sense of insecurity. Her spirit was constantly in a state of high tension, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She found herself wishing, perhaps more than anything, that these good days could last just a little longer. Because of this, Sarah spoke and acted with extreme caution, terrified of doing anything that might make Jack angry. During dinner, we see her watching him closely as he tries to hand her the soft, white flour bread. She insisted on eating the coarse, tough bread herself, claiming that the white bread simply wasn't to her taste. It was Sarah who had asked him to make the white bread in the first place, but once it was ready, she wouldn't take a single bite. She left every piece for him, which was a sacrifice in its own right. In truth, Jack didn't care what he ate, as long as she could live in peace and stop wandering about. He was satisfied with that much. Yet, Sarah still couldn't understand how he had changed so suddenly for the better. It wasn't as if he hadn't been drunk before. To be honest, those were the times she feared most. After those drinking bouts, he had always done things that were reckless and cruel. Upon waking, he would kneel and beg for her forgiveness, making the most vehement oaths to change. Every time the hangover faded, he would certainly restrain himself for a little while. But it only ever lasted 2 or 3 days before he returned to his old, selfish ways. He would go back to his carousing. She had never seen him like this, cooking and heating water every day. He was even looking after the child, going so far as to buy him a complete set of new clothes and shoes. Sarah saw it all very clearly. She constantly reminded herself to stay alert and guarded. She was determined not to let herself fall into this sweet whirlwind of affection again. If the dream were to end one day and reality turned cold again, she wondered what she would do. Jack had no idea, of course, about the turmoil and doubts swirling in his wife's heart. As the sky began to darken, he finally finished tidying up the west room of the house. That west room, built of tile and mud, had always been filled with junk and left completely uninhabited. The newspapers lining the walls were as decayed as old cobwebs. They simply crumbled at the slightest touch. Even after a thorough cleaning, the room remained thick with dust. With agile hands, Jack improvised a small bed using wooden planks, successfully completing the task his wife had set for him. When Sarah saw him emerge covered in sweat, she quickly grabbed a towel and held it out to him. She told him to dry off quickly, as dinner would be ready in just a moment. Instead of reaching for the towel, Jack leaned his tall, lean frame slightly forward. He brought his handsome, energetic face close to his wife's. With a warm breath, he playfully asked if she would help him dry off herself. Hearing this, Sarah glanced at him instinctively, then noticed Lily entering the house, carrying her things. Once the girl was inside, Sarah stood on her tiptoes and raised her hand to wipe the sweat from his forehead, though she didn't forget to give him a warning. She reminded him there was a stranger in the house now. From now on, when he got up in the morning, he wasn't to walk around shirtless or in his underwear. To ensure the young girl wouldn't be embarrassed, Jack kept his bright dark eyes fixed on his wife, who was standing so close. Seeing her dry him so carefully while minding these small details, he felt a genuine warmth in his heart, though it felt a bit restrictive not to walk freely in his own home. Seeing Sarah's serious expression, he leaned in and brushed her lips. He gave Sarah a kiss as fleeting as a dragonfly skimming the water's surface. After the kiss, he readily agreed to follow whatever rules she set for him. Because of that sudden, intimate gesture, Sarah found herself blushing all the way to her ears. If they had been alone in the house, it would have been one thing and perfectly fine. But now, there was a young, single woman living under their roof as well. With her face still burning, she couldn't help but think how utterly shameless Jack was being. She scolded him gently, telling him not to linger and to go wash his hands for dinner. She turned and hurried to the kitchen, while Jack, watching his wife retreat, couldn't help but grin. A wide smile of pure satisfaction spread across his handsome face as he watched her go. He walked over to the well and pulled up a bucket of cold, refreshing water. With a quick splash, he washed his face, trying to rinse away the sticky sweat from his skin. It was quite uncomfortable. He glanced around and saw that, for the moment, he was alone in the yard. He pulled off his shirt and poured the bucket of cold water directly over his head. It felt incredibly refreshing, though he hadn't expected Lily to step out of the house at that exact moment. She saw him there with his arms bare and his back to her, revealing a lean, powerful frame. His muscles were well proportioned with defined lines, though his back bore the marks of a few old scratches. Lily felt her cheeks begin to burn with a sudden, unexpected heat. Embarrassed by the sight, she quickly turned around and retreated back into the safety of the house. That old adobe hut offered no soundproofing, and it remained dark and thick with dust everywhere. Deep down, Lily felt as though she couldn't endure staying in such a place for even a single day. Hearing the splashing water, Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying the dinner plates. She caught sight of him immediately, standing there shirtless and dripping as if he'd just stepped out of a river. Instantly, a wave of protective fury washed over her. She set the food down on the stone patio table, marched over, and grabbed Jack's arm to pull him inside. She scolded him, asking what he would do if he caught a cold in this weather. Jack simply let himself be led indoors by his wife, listening to her constant stream of complaints. But deep down, he felt a pleasant warmth, knowing she truly cared for his well-being. Once inside, Sarah grabbed a small child's blanket and stood on her tiptoes to reach him. She carefully dried the water from his head, so focused on the task that she didn't even blink. All the while, she continued her lecture, telling him to hurry up and lower his head. She didn't notice at all that he was watching her with a completely shameless grin. Hearing his wife's command, he quickly widened his stance and obediently lowered his head for her. She proceeded to dry the water droplets from his back, one by one, with great care. As she saw the old marks on his skin, her heart skipped a beat with a sudden rush of emotion. She realized she hadn't felt this way before, and the thought made Sarah's heart race even faster. She tossed the blanket over his head and told him he could dry his own chest. She instructed him to change his trousers once he was dry and then come out for dinner. Sarah lifted the fabric curtain and stepped out, nearly bumping into the man coming from the west room. They shared a brief look, and she offered a small, polite smile. In a house made of mud and tile, the living space was barely the size of a palm, to be honest. Whatever was said in the east room could be heard perfectly clearly in the west room. Lily sat there in the silence, unsure whether she should sit down or remain standing. She felt uncomfortable in every possible way, as if the very air had grown heavy. As night fell, just as Mike picked up his chopsticks to begin the meal, Lily looked up and saw him with a deep frown and a dark, brooding expression. Her heart skipped a beat, her hand trembled, and her chopsticks hit the floor with a dull thud. In that single instant, she felt her entire world begin to crumble once again. She thought he had shown his true face so quickly, despite her hopes that this time might be different. The dream ended abruptly. She set down the other chopstick, avoided his gaze, and took a deep breath. She managed to eat half a roll and 2 pieces of egg, her voice remaining deceptively calm. But beneath the table, her hands gripped her old clothes tightly, her entire body trembling. The sound of the falling chopsticks snapped Mike back to reality, and he realized something was wrong. Looking closely, he saw Lily's eyes were reddened, and his own heart tightened with sudden guilt. He panicked immediately. He had only been worried she wasn't eating enough, to be honest. But without thinking, his tone had come out far too harsh, and he had terrified her. He reached out to hold her, but she flinched away, sending him into an even deeper state of panic. Imagine this, a man nearly 6'3" crouching before his wife, his face filled with genuine anguish. He pleaded with her, explaining he was only in a hurry and never intended to scold her. As his tone softened, Lily's suppressed sadness finally broke, and her tears began to fall one after another. In that moment, she had been truly frightened, thinking he had returned to being that violent, ill-tempered demon. His heart ached for her. He gently lifted her up and pulled her into the safety of his arms. We are left wondering what really happened just moments ago as the courtyard fell into silence. Inside the room, Mike gazed tenderly at the woman in his arms, her eyes still red from crying. Seeing the delicate tip of her reddened nose, he felt a sharp pang in his heart, as if he'd been stabbed. He lowered his head and gently kissed her eyelids, trying to soothe her lingering fear. In a soft, trembling voice, he whispered that he was truly sorry for what had happened. He admitted he was wrong, explaining he only feared she wasn't eating and had scolded her out of urgency. He told her that being busy all day made him worry since he couldn't watch over her meals personally. His tone had been far too harsh, but hearing this, Lily began to feel a sense of relief. She had truly believed he had reverted to that violent, ill-tempered demon who used to hurt her. He repeated how his busy schedule made it impossible to keep an eye on her throughout the day. His excessive worry had simply translated into a voice that sounded much angrier than he intended. Lily felt much more at ease now, even wondering if she had overreacted just a moment ago. Lately, he had pampered and protected her so much that she had grown unaccustomed to any friction. She had become quite delicate, and once things were cleared up, she felt a wave of embarrassment. Her pale hands gripped his shirt tightly against his chest, her eyelids drooping slightly in shame. She bit her lower lip, remaining silent as she processed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Then, without any warning, Mike suddenly spoke up with a look of confusion. He asked her what was happening, his eyes following the direction of his own pointing fingers. It was then that Lily noticed she was likely leaking breast milk through her clothing. Before she could even respond, he began thinking about the preparations he had been making lately. Lily's pale, delicate face flushed a deep red instantly, looking very much like a ripe persimmon. She pulled away from his embrace, turning her back to him in a sudden rush of modesty. With a clear, firm voice, she told him that he needed to leave the room immediately. Lately, she had been drinking chicken and fish soup every single day to help with nursing. She hadn't been sure if it was working, but for the past 2 days, the baby had only taken breast milk. The infant had stopped using formula entirely, yet even so, her milk supply remained incredibly abundant. The swelling had been causing her quite a bit of discomfort throughout the day. That scoundrel Mike had helped her out a bit the night before, which made her feel much better today. But the leaking continued regardless, and with her face flushing a deep crimson, she tilted her head and began to undo her buttons, completely unaware of her surroundings. We see Mike staring intently at her, his eyes wide with a very specific kind of eagerness. She didn't notice at first that he was watching her every move with such rapt attention. His gaze was wide and anxious, and the moment Lily removed her outer layer of clothing, she realized this shameless man was staring directly at her without blinking. Feeling both embarrassed and annoyed, she snapped at him, asking what on earth he was doing. She told him to get out quickly so she could fix her clothes in peace. Mike had absolutely no intention of leaving. Instead, he leaned his head in just a little closer. He softly called her his wife, reminding her that the baby was already fast asleep. He suggested that if the swelling was hurting her that much, he should be the one to help. Meanwhile, Sarah was sitting on the stone bench outside, resting her cheek against her hand. Darkness had fallen and the stars and moon were out, yet the couple still hadn't emerged from the room. Sarah didn't quite dare to go inside and take a look for herself. She could only wait, and after a long while, the two of them finally emerged from the house. Sarah noticed her sister-in-law's eyes were misty, her cheeks flushed, and her lips were a bright, juicy red. One has to wonder, had she been properly comforted? Lily, seeing Sarah staring so intently at her, suddenly remembered what had just happened. Her face felt incredibly hot as she sat down, picked up the chopsticks, and handed them to Sarah. She suggested they eat, handing another pair of chopsticks to the man sitting beside her. After sitting down, Mike didn't even give Sarah a single glance. Instead, he took a fine flour bun and placed it directly into his wife's hands. While he grabbed a coarse grain bun and began eating in large, hungry bites, he was thinking to himself about heading to the lake when he had time to catch a few carp so his wife could grow stronger. Lily, of course, had no idea what her man was thinking. She was mostly worried that Sarah might be feeling a bit uncomfortable. She offered Sarah a fine flour bun, telling her not to be polite and to just eat. She told her to feel at home, while Sarah took a small bite and began to wonder, was this family actually poor or wealthy? If they were poor, they certainly ate fine flour buns. The meal consisted of scrambled eggs and meat, which wouldn't be out of place even in the city. That morning, at the village chief's house, they had been eating black cornbread. It was accompanied only by pickled radishes. Yet, if they were rich, they lived in 3 simple mud houses. Aside from the television they bought today, they didn't own a single decent piece of furniture. Even the bed she slept on was nothing more than a few makeshift wooden boards. When Mike had made the bed, she actually feared it might break if she moved during the night. Then she remembered hearing him tell the tractor driver earlier that he planned to build a new house. So, was this old house about to be demolished? It certainly seemed that way. If so, they wouldn't even have a place to live. Why on earth did he want her to stay? It was quite obvious that this older brother had no room in his heart for anyone but his wife. He clearly didn't like her living here. As she sat lost in thought, a child's cry drifted from the house. In the next instant, Mike stood up and told Lily to keep eating and not to worry. He strode into the house, flipped on the light, and lifted his newly awakened daughter from her crib. Lily set down her chopsticks and reached out to take the baby, but Mike gently moved away. He told her to eat first, claiming that he wasn't even hungry yet. He insisted he would eat later, though Lily knew the truth of the matter quite well. He simply wanted her to finish her meal first, which is why he pretended he wasn't hungry. He had just returned from a long day out and had been busy clearing heavy debris. How could he not be starving? She didn't call him out on it, however, and simply continued eating. Meanwhile, Sarah nibbled on her bun, quietly observing the dynamic between the couple from the corner of her eye. Without meaning to, she began to compare this scene to the life in her own home. When her own two older brothers came back, they almost never bothered to look after the children. Whenever the babies cried, it was always her sisters-in-law who had to soothe them first. They would hold the child with one arm while struggling to eat their dinner with the other. But seeing this older brother pacing the yard, cradling the child to comfort her, seemed almost unbelievable to Sarah. Lily finished her meal quickly, took the baby from Mike's arms, and headed back into the house. Left alone for a moment, Sarah stole a secretive glance at the young man sitting across from her. She watched as he devoured the buns and eggs, his cold face remaining entirely expressionless. He radiated a sense of distance and frostiness that was completely different from when his wife was present. It was as if he had two entirely distinct personalities, a bit unsettling, to say the least. Sarah looked at him and felt a sudden chill. She simply couldn't find a way to feel at ease. Stammering slightly, she told him that she had finished her dinner. He gathered the plates without a word and carried them off to the kitchen. After washing up, Sarah retreated to the west room, not daring to step outside again that night. When darkness finally fell, Mike sat alone in the courtyard and finished the 4 remaining coarse flour buns. He drank the flour soup to fill his stomach, finally finding a moment of peace in the quiet night. Later, he heated a pot of water and brought the basin into the bedroom for his wife. He reminded her to wash up before mentioning that he was heading out to use the restroom. He set the basin down on its stand and stepped out into the cool night air. Inside, Lily closed the door, undressed, and began to bathe with the warm water. Just as she finished dressing, she heard a suspicious rustling noise coming from behind the house. She thought she might have misheard, but in the next instant, a man's voice drifted in from outside. "Little sister, are you bathing?" the voice asked, making the hair on Lily's neck stand on end. She let out a piercing scream, which Mike heard just as he was finishing up outside the house. Mike rushed inside and immediately caught Lily as she threw herself into his arms. He held her tightly while she trembled, his voice filled with concern as he asked what had happened. Lily wrapped both arms around his waist, her entire body shaking with fear. She managed to whisper that someone was behind the house, and Mike's dark eyes narrowed instantly. He looked toward the courtyard wall and, sure enough, spotted a head disappearing into the distance. In an instant, his deep eyes were clouded with a dark, simmering fury. He looked down at the woman in his arms, realizing she was still only in her undergarments. Gently, he lifted her up and placed her safely back onto the bed. He stepped out of the bedroom and spoke to Sarah, who was standing nervously by her door. He told her to watch over Lily while he stepped out for a moment, and without another word, he marched out of the courtyard with long, purposeful strides. His tall, slender silhouette was quickly swallowed by the thick darkness of the night. Over at the house of a local named Ernie, neighbors soon heard the most harrowing cries of pain. The screams were punctuated by the dull, heavy thud of fists, a sound that chilled everyone who heard it. Everyone in the village knew Mike was a ruthless man, a natural-born fighter who didn't play games. They had no idea how Ernie had provoked him, but from the noise, Mike was certainly teaching him a lesson. The neighbors feared he might actually kill the man, as Ernie begged for mercy, claiming he'd made a mistake. Ernie stammered that he only went to see Sarah, the young teacher, and swore he hadn't seen anything. Upon hearing Ernie's pathetic pleas, Mike reached out and coldly dislocated the man's jaw. He asked what nonsense the man was spewing, wondering aloud if Ernie had a sudden craving for trouble. We see Ernie lying there, broken and barely able to breathe. He didn't even have the strength to pull himself up and kneel. To be honest, it truly looked as though Mike might beat him to death. For a fleeting moment, Mike really did want to finish him off right then and there. But as he thought of Lily and her daughter, he held back, ensuring his blows weren't fatal. Meanwhile, Lily lay in bed. She had no idea how much time had passed until she heard water splashing. She knew then that Mike had returned. He was out in the courtyard, washing away the night in cold water. After 10 minutes, the sound of the door opening and closing echoed through the quiet room. In the heavy darkness, Mike assumed that she was already fast asleep. He entered with light, careful steps, and just as he began to feel his way toward the bed, she spoke. A soft voice drifted from the pillows, simply saying, "You're back." Lily reached out her arm and clicked on the light, bathing the room in a warm glow. Mike paused as the light hit him, seeing her resting her head gently on one hand. Her dark, shining hair fell gracefully over her pale shoulders, a stark contrast to the night's violence. He lowered his gaze and climbed into bed, reaching up to plunge the room back into darkness. In the shadows, he pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her slender waist. He patted her back gently, telling his wife to remain calm and stay at peace. He told her to sleep. Before his return, she hadn't dared to even close her eyes. She had been terrified he wouldn't control his strength and might kill someone, sparking endless village gossip. She had been truly frightened. She curled into his arms like a kitten, her cheek pressed to his firm chest. His skin was burning hot, and she lay there listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. Gradually, her sobbing subsided. She didn't dare cry out loud, fearing she might wake their daughter. Seeing his wife in such a state, Mike felt as though he hadn't hit those men nearly enough. He had assumed that, given his own rough reputation, the local thugs wouldn't dare cross him. But he hadn't expected that some would still harbor such malicious intentions toward his family. However, after tonight, anyone who had been entertaining such twisted thoughts would likely think twice. Lily noticed the exhaustion etched on his face, remembering how he had been leaving early and returning late, breaking stones at the lake to sell just to give her every cent he earned. Seeing him protect and comfort her, she finally understood that he truly was a changed man. In the heavy darkness, Lily, exhausted from her tears, eventually drifted off into a deep sleep. Hearing the steady, even breathing of his companion, Mike was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. The next morning, Lily was stirred from her dreams by the sound of voices drifting in from outside. The West Room remained unchanged. Normally, no family in the village was even willing to buy it. A neighbor named Gail finished a bowl of sugar water and approached their sister-in-law, Sarah. She asked in a low, prying voice, "Sarah, yesterday, didn't it sound like Lily was screaming?" Sarah set down her water jug and looked at the nosy Gail with a knowing, unimpressed expression. "Your house is over a mile away from Lily's, and yet you still claim to have heard something? What's the matter? Do you have nothing better to do at night than lurk under that couple's window?" Hearing this, Gail simply smirked without answering, her mind racing back to the rumors of the previous night. She had heard that Mike left Ernie half dead and broke his leg. A bit excessive, perhaps. It seemed this city-born wife was proving to be quite a source of trouble for the village. Gail couldn't help but think that Lily was surely being unfaithful behind Mike's back. She was practically bursting with the urge to spread that particular piece of gossip. Sarah, however, had absolutely no desire to entertain her neighbor's nonsense. She picked up the water jug to serve the others, then leaned in and gave Mike a knowing wink. In a low voice, she suggested he go check on Lily. Normally, she noted, Lily would have been awake and moving by this hour. She was worried that the poor woman might have been frightened into falling ill. Mike paused his work immediately. When he had risen that morning, she was still sound asleep. It was 10 o'clock now as he pulled back the curtain and stepped into the bedroom. Lily stirred as he entered, and he instinctively pulled her into a warm, protective embrace. He told her to take her time getting dressed, promising to bring her breakfast shortly. His voice was a bit husky, and the room remained dim with the curtains still drawn. Hearing the commotion outside, Lily couldn't help but ask what all the noise was about. He explained that they were repairing the courtyard wall, and the place was currently a mess. He gently advised his wife to stay inside for now while the work was being finished. She playfully asked why he wouldn't let her go, and he simply smiled in response. He held her even tighter, telling her he wanted to stay like this just a moment longer. Then, with a bit of a mischievous glint, he told her he'd only let go for a kiss. She turned in his arms, telling him not to be so naughty and to release her quickly. She reminded him there were people right outside, but he just laughed at the idea. He reminded her that she was his wife, and all he was asking for was a simple kiss. His voice took on a tone of playful, wounded pride as he asked if she really wouldn't even grant him that. Lily opened her mouth to explain herself, but in the end, she decided to say nothing at all. Instead, she leaned in and gave Mike a soft, gentle kiss on the cheek. She told him to let her go now, and after that kiss, Mike's eyes practically sparkled with joy. Feeling quite happy with himself, he cupped her face and returned the kiss properly. He told her, with complete sincerity, just how much he truly adored her. She urged him to release her, pointing out again that there were people right outside and staying in the room was boring. Without a second thought, she told him she wanted to go outside and help with the work. He rejected the idea immediately, suggesting that if she was bored, he would ask Sarah to come in later. He promised to find her some company, knowing full well there was no chance he'd let her help outside. Seeing that the door wasn't going to be opened for her, she retreated to the bedroom to play with their daughter. With so many hands helping, the courtyard wall was finally completed around 4 in the afternoon. The wall stood over 6 feet high, and its top was now lined with jagged shards of broken glass. Without the help of a ladder, it would be nearly impossible for an ordinary person to scale such a height. And that was even before considering the sharp glass waiting for anyone brave enough to try. To be honest, having a fortified courtyard like this was something entirely new for this neighborhood. Behind the house, Jake's brother smiled. He had been out late the previous night. He had seen those two women whispering and gesturing toward Mike's bedroom window. The way they were looking at Mike was, to put it mildly, far from innocent. We see that Jake, who had been watching from the shadows, saw everything and heard every single word. He decided then and there that these two women needed to be taught a serious lesson. It was truly disappointing that his own uncle's sisters-in-law turned out to be that kind of people. They claimed they came to help, but in reality, they only showed up to drink sugar water. One of them, Kathy, even brought her own teacup, while the other two were clearly hiding something. It appeared she had snatched quite a few of the snacks prepared for the actual workers. Jake thought long and hard about how to handle them, knowing Kathy and Sarah had to be dealt with. To avoid future trouble, he finished dinner and walked calmly over to his Uncle Bill's house. Bill and his two sons hadn't moved out yet. They were all still living together under one roof. When Jake arrived, the entire family was sitting around the table finishing their evening meal. The sight of him standing there so suddenly caught everyone completely off guard. Kathy asked if he had eaten yet, while his Aunt Mary took a quick bite of rice and stood up. Without saying a word, Jake walked straight toward Kathy and grabbed her firmly by the hair. It was a shocking move that left everyone in the room absolutely stunned and speechless. As Kathy let out a sharp cry of pain, the rest of the family finally snapped out of their daze. Bill jumped up from his chair, shouting at Jake and asking if he had completely lost his mind. Jake only gave a cold, hollow smile, asking his uncle if he really thought he was the crazy one. He told Bill to ask his own wife. Kathy never imagined the news would reach Jake's ears so fast. She certainly didn't expect him to show up so soon, and Jake began to openly confront her. As the truth came out, Mary and Bill felt the color drain from their faces in total disbelief. Bill couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the woman they had brought into their home, or if she was simply a curse. Under normal circumstances, they had always feared their son might follow the poor example set by someone like Jake. They had warned her 1,000 times to stay away, yet here she was, still daring to slander others so openly. Deep down, Sarah cursed the fact that Jake wasn't a good person, though she was hardly one to judge. She found herself at a loss for words as Mary stood up, trying to find a way to explain the situation. Mary suggested there might be a misunderstanding and urged Jake to let go of Kathy first. After all, as she reminded him, Sarah was still his cousin-in-law and part of the family. Jake shot a look at Mary, making it clear he didn't think much of her character either. He told her to sit down, and seeing the cold determination in his eyes, Mary began to feel deeply uneasy. She glanced at her husband, Bill, who remained completely silent throughout the confrontation, clearly having no desire whatsoever to get dragged into this particular mess. Suddenly, Jake raised his hand and delivered a sharp slap across Sarah's face. He warned her that if she kept talking nonsense, he would personally see to it that she couldn't speak at all. Sarah was left reeling from the blow, having never imagined he would actually dare to lay a hand on her. Not a single person in the family moved to stop him as he struck her 6 more times before finally letting go. Sarah was seeing stars and found it nearly impossible to keep her balance after the assault. She stumbled and fell toward her son, but he simply pushed her away with surprising force. Bill spoke up calmly, asking Sarah if she was truly that desperate for attention. He wondered aloud if she simply couldn't stand to see Jake and his wife living a happy life. It was clear to everyone now that she had been doing nothing but sowing discord with her lies. She insisted she never said those things, but even after being struck, she found no compassion from the others. Aside from denying everything until the bitter end, Sarah realized she had no other way out of this. Jake asked her if she truly hadn't said those things, even daring her to swear it was the truth. To be honest, Sarah was far too inexperienced to face off against a clever old fox like Jake. He told her that if she was lying, she was essentially wishing a miserable end upon her entire family. He even included her children in that dark oath, and those words effectively sealed Sarah's mouth shut. She felt a sudden wave of remorse and began to stutter, completely unable to find her voice again. At that moment, everyone in the room finally understood what had actually taken place. As Jake's gaze swept across the room, Mary felt a sudden, sharp prickle of fear wash over her. Heaven knows she hadn't even dared to breathe for a moment, terrified the man's mood might shift again. We see Jake watching his wife, Kathy, noticing that her breathing was finally starting to calm down. He felt himself relax, realizing that from now on, he would need to have many heart-to-heart talks with her. He wanted to take her into town to distract her, but he knew how late the hour had become. He assumed she wouldn't want to go, likely fearing that if they went to the city and he grew careless, he might actually try to sell their daughter. Still, he thought a little distraction would do her good. He gently asked his wife if she wanted to join him for a walk down at the foot of the mountain. He promised to catch a quail for her, hoping to give her a small treat to brighten her mood. Mary actually felt like going, not because she craved the quail, but because of how things had been lately. Jake hadn't been letting her go out to work in the fields to earn their usual labor points. He kept telling her to stay home, focus on her health, and make sure she was raising the baby well. She had returned to work in the fields the very day after giving birth, showing no concern for her own recovery. But now, he was finally looking out for her. She had no idea what kind of deal he had made with the foreman. But the two workers stayed away from the fields, and the foreman didn't come by to rush them at all. We see that his wife was clearly tempted by the offer, yet she still hesitated for a moment. Her gaze wandered indecisively among the people gathered in the courtyard, unsure of what to do. Jake knew his wife was worried that if they left, their few belongings at home wouldn't be safe. He simply laughed it off, telling her not to worry and to wait just a moment, which, naturally, was easier said than done. After saying this, Kathy stayed behind while Jake stepped out of the kitchen with the child in his arms, having dealt with the others. Everyone in the main room filed out, and he even made sure to send Lily on her way as well. To be honest, Lily actually wanted to follow the little family of 3 on their outing. Imagine the scene, a walk to the foot of the mountain where tigers were rumored to roam, a place the young students never dared to approach, but seeing she wasn't exactly welcome, she had no choice but to leave. She could only wander aimlessly through the village, left to her own devices. On the way, Jake noticed his wife glancing at him repeatedly, as if she were holding back something important. He stopped in his tracks and looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to find the words. Kathy finally gathered her courage and asked Jake if she could do something the following day. She wanted to know if she could visit her parents' house, just for a short while. He told her he would go with her. After being married for so long, the man by her side was finally behaving like a decent person. He was finally learning how to earn money to support the household. He was taking care of his wife and daughter, and Kathy simply wanted to visit her parents to put her mother's mind at ease. She wanted her mother to stop worrying that she had married the wrong man, once and for all. Jake had expected something far more dramatic after seeing her prepare herself to speak for so long. But it turned out to be just that simple request. He held his daughter close with one arm, and with his free hand, he took his wife's hand in his. He promised they would go together tomorrow.